Hi, Andrew. Can we do a quick mic check for you, please?
Hi Ken, how you doing?
Good. Welcome. Sounds good.
Excellent, thank you very much. Hope everybody's ready for a good afternoon.
That's right.
Sure are. That's the plan.
Do you guys get to see how many people have kind of joined elsewhere? I guess. I guess you see 23 other people, right? So a total of 31.
All right, so far. So, hey, Tom, can we check your audio, please? And you're probably on double mute. So, welcome everyone. This is Ken Keels with the Transmission Forum staff. We'll get started in about 3 minutes. And getting worked out with our speakers, and we'll be with you shortly.
Ken, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, you were muted on WebEx, but you're in the panel.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is Ken Keels with the Transmission Forum staff. I have the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know people are still joining. Looks like getting close to 70 people on the web so far. So welcome back to those of you who attended yesterday. This is day 2 of the Epri and NATF Transmission Resilience Summit webinar. I'm the Director of Initiatives for the Transmission Forum, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Next slide, please. So as we did yesterday afternoon, or the second part of the meeting yesterday, we are in a closed session that's available only to NATF and EPRI members, so some reminders about the confidentiality and other policies of both organizations. We want to make sure we protect confidential and proprietary information obtained in this session. As a NATF and Epri members only, keep it within the membership. You can share with the employees of the NATF and employees of Epri member companies have a need to know, just make sure they understand as well to keep the information confidential. We also want to obey antitrust laws and guidelines, adhere to your individual organization standards of conduct, and protect intellectual property. Next slide. So similar to yesterday, for today, all lines were muted on entry. Folks that have a question, you can enter that through the chat. It says Q&A panel. We do not have the Q&A panel turned on for this session. So either the chat or preferably raise your hand to ask a question or make a comment. I'll recognize you then, unmute your line, and you can ask your question, and then would like for you to lower your hand, your virtual hand, and remute your line after you've finished with your question or comment. We will be posting the presentations following the event, so you can access those. NATF members will access them through the portal, transport, and Epri members will access it through the Epri members portal. Next slide. So in order to get the best features of the WebEx, we have just a couple of folks that are dialed in separately from their web connection. If you'd like to change that, just go on to the next slide. If you'd like to change that so that we can identify you, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you can. Let's just go on to the because people have dialed in already. Go to the next slide where we have the. I'm sorry, back up one. I was reading it the wrong way. Yeah, to reconnect to the alternate, you can go into the audio panel, which is either at the bottom of your screen or in the one of the menu bars, and select the switch audio feature and use the call me feature to get that connection. So we just have a few folks that are dialed in without alignment with their web feature. Next slide. So for raising your hand, there's two different ways that you could have entered the session today. If you use the desktop application, which is visualized in the left-hand side of the slide, the way to see your hand-raising option is to open the participants panel, and which is a menu bar at the bottom of your screen, and then at the bottom of the list of panelists, or you will see, or the attendee panel, you'll see a little hand icon that you can click on to raise your hand. Next slide. If you join via the browser, which is indicated in the left-hand side of the slide, a little different visualization for raising your hand. We'll select the menu button with the three dots on it, and that'll show you the icon to raise and lower your hand. Next slide. So just to kind of kick off with another little safety message, in keeping with the theme of fall that is now upon us, in many parts of the continent, we're seeing the leaves starting to change and falling, and it creates a number of different safety potential hazards with the opportunity for slips and spins and slide outs. So just a reminder to keep drives and walkway clear of leaves. They can create a slipping hazard for pedestrians. Use caution on roads where there are leaves in the highway. And then when you get into the situation where you have snowfall, then the snow mixed in with the leaves makes it a increased hazard of falling. And then just keeping those tidy in the yard and things is keeping those cleaned up will help prevent those types of accidents from occurring. Next slide. So Today's agenda, we'll start out with some general overviews from both the NATF and Epri on resilience-related activities, and then we'll take a brief break, and then we'll get into some more specific activities and interest, starting with some lessons learned from resilience activities from the NATF, report on resource adequacy from Epri, and an EMP update from Randy Horton at Epri as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to lead off this afternoon's session with an update on the NATF resilience activities. Go ahead to the next slide. So these are the topics that I'll cover, mostly focused on resilience activities, but there are some other related activities that we'll cover as well later in the presentation. Next slide. So yesterday, when we kicked off the meeting, Andrew Phillips from Epri mentioned the first of the resilience summits that we conducted back in 2013, and that was one of the earlier engagements between the NATF and Epri on resilience. There were a couple of other triggers to that. The high impact low frequency task force report that NERC produced, and then Hurricane Sandy, which kind of highlighted a change where you're seeing events occurring in areas that are different than you normally expect. And then of course, as Tom Galloway mentioned yesterday, the Metcalf substation attack drew a lot of interest in the physical security aspects, and that's when we first started our summits around resilience topics. And since then, there's been just a lot of activity within the NATF beyond just the annual summits, and some of that's highlighted in the timeline here. And I think some of the key takeaways from what we've learned over the years is that a lot of the focus on resilience has changed, so that we're now really focused more on the more intense, wider spread, and becoming more frequent events that have larger impacts on the bulk electric system, bulk power system. So as we continue to mature in our thinking and knowledge on resilience, we're going to continue to develop new products and activities within the NATF. Next slide. So bit of a rundown on some key activities, and this certainly doesn't reflect everything, but one of the more recent developments was the kickoff of our resilience steering group within the NATF, and this is a group of resilience leaders within the membership that will help the NATF discuss and plot a course for resilience activities going forward. We had a resilience technical advisory group several years ago, but this is going to be more of a steering group to help us drive out our activities and work plans around resilience. We also we do have a Epri liaison, as well as a liaison from our Restore Spare Sharing program in the resilience steering group. So I'll talk a little bit more about that Restore program in a minute. Excuse me. So, gosh, I'm a little congestion here. So another significant effort in the last several years was the development of a transmission resilience maturity model, and you heard Dan Smith mention it yesterday during his presentation. This was a work product developed by the Department of Energy, the NATF, Pacific Northwest National Labs, and Epri to essentially create a publicly available tool to enable transmission utilities to conduct a self-assessment and establish kind of help to establish a roadmap for improving their resilience program over time. It's been used well within our membership, and Linda Estep is going to provide a more detailed overview of that program later this afternoon. Additionally, the NATF has worked overtime with the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council and the Department of Energy to build out some protocols for how a grid security emergency order from the Department of Energy might be initiated and communicated to the utilities, to the industry, in the event of a declared national emergency by the U.S. President. And this has been quite a bit of activity, but the NATF created an initial report to the DOE highlighting some of the key factors of how best to implement grid security emergency orders. And one of the key takeaways from that activity was the notion of using existing tools for that for those communications, communicating through the reliability coordinators, where we've already got protocols established to take care of emergency events. Next slide. We've already talked quite a bit about the summits and webinars that we've conducted jointly with Epri. The NATF also conducted a number of special webinars over time on different resilience topics. And then lastly, on Restore, and I think I've got a little more detail on each of these slides later. Restore is a program that existed among several of our NATF members to enable the sharing of transformers during a specific triggering event. And we've onboarded that program into the NATF in 2020, and it provides an opportunity for our NATF members to join that program, designate spare transformers that could be made available to share, and provide a mechanism for that sharing to occur in the event of an event. That's easy to say. And it does complement other spare sharing programs such as the EEI Strategic Transformer, Spare Transformer Emergency Program, and the Grid Assurance Program. Next slide. So I probably went into a little more detail during that run-up than I needed to. So for the Resilience Steering Group, as I mentioned, we've got a select group of leaders and advisors in the resilience arena, and it's helping to guide the NATF efforts on resilience and also help us to coordinate with Epri by having the liaison with Epri. And also, Restore is a key resilience program. It's important to have a representative from Restore in that steering group as well. So we started back up in July of this year and had a couple of really good positive meetings, a lot of good input from the participants. And that group will help drive out some specific activities around resilience and help to improve the overall program within the NATF. Next slide. So one thing to highlight on the grid security emergencies, I talked a little bit earlier about the importance of communications. Earlier this year in the summer, in conjunction with the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, there was a tabletop exercise conducted, really focused around the anticipated collaborative discussions between the Department of Energy and industry in the event of a significant emergency circumstance, a grid security emergency. And it was a scenario designed around a potential attack on the physical facilities in the western part of the U.S. and some Pacific locations that would potentially impede a hypothetical defense facility from performing its mission. And so we went through that exercise with a couple of the members and utilities having larger roles, but it was a real effective exercise just to test out some of the priorities around grid security emergency. And you see on the slide some of the key takeaways from that exercise, and pointed out some things that we've been highlighting in our discussions with the ESCC working group as well as the DOE, that it's important not to put too much detail in the orders, because the circumstances are always going to be different depending on the nature of the event, and the impacted utility or utilities need to be flexible in how to respond to it, and utilities are used to transmission owners and operators are used to dealing with significant events in different fashions. The other key point that we've made over time is the importance of the reliability coordinators being the primary points of contact. And then lastly, one of the key takeaways that we continue to promote is the importance of having robust and efficient communications, and that's highlighting the use of the familiar systems and protocols like the RC hotline, and then furthermore enhancing the resilience of those systems to be able to withstand potential loss of continuity in those communication systems. So that's some work yet to be done in that arena. Next slide. So we conducted a number of resilience summits over the years, and we were supposed to have one in person last year in 2020, but with the pandemic we had to cancel that one. So we moved it to the fall of this year. We are targeting holding another face-to-face summit in the spring of 2022, with NERC joining us again as we had back in 2019. We're thanking SRP for offering to host. We'll make decisions on confirming the face-to-face nature of it as we get into the early part of next year, so people can start making their plans. But look forward to having everybody in person at the summit next spring. Next slide. I mentioned the special webinars that we had. We had an entire series that the Resilience Technical Advisory Group put together back in 2019, and then an example of that was Planning for System Resilience, which was conducted in early 2020. Those webinars were recorded and all posted on Transport for NETF members. And then more recently, we started a series of educational webinars around the transmission resilience maturity model. So, like I said, a number of webinars on the resilience topic, special webinars to highlight some key learnings from our activities. Next slide. A few more examples of those resilience topics, and then for 2022 we have a couple more planned on resilience program management, overall program management, as well as a roadmap to establishing and enhancing a resilience program. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, Restore was a program, an agreement that was developed in the 2016 timeframe with you can see Southern Company, LGE and KU, PPL, and TVA. Started with the concept and then signed on another several participants, and one of the drivers in that development was the report that the DOE issued back in 2017. That was at that time looking at establishing a strategic transformer reserve for industry, and much of the response to that report from industry was around, industry has some programs already in place that can serve that same purpose, and the Restore program was an example of that. So that program came to fruition among several utilities pretty much in the eastern part of the U.S. currently. Part of the development of that program was getting pre-authorization from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for the transfer of spare equipment under the circumstances spelled out in the in the agreement for Restore. So that's kind of a key thing to prevent some delays in doing those transfers in a short time frame when there is an emergency situation underway. As I mentioned, we rolled it into the NATF in January of 2020 as a voluntary self-funding program for our members. And just this year, we are in the process of completing a tabletop exercise to test out the program and take some lessons learned from that to help improve the program and the processes and the different forms and documents that might be used. Next slide. A little bit of latency here. So just highlight some of the key points around Restore. It's I did want to highlight that it is supplemental to Epri EEI STEP program and to grid assurance. There's as you can see on the slide, 18 of our member companies are currently participating in Restore. That represents roughly 40 utilities. And currently, there are 7 transformer voltage classes that are in the program. It is self-funding, so only the NATF members who are actually participating in the program provide the funding for it. It's a relatively inexpensive participation feature for members to have that peace of mind that they can identify a potential replacement transformer if something happens. So I see there's a question in the chat. It was noted that we do have a number of participants in Restore that are also in the STEP program. One of the key differences between the two is in the triggering and the nature of the triggering event. The STEP program requires a presidential emergency declaration in order to trigger the spare sharing under STEP. The NATF program, the Restore program, has a specific defined triggering event. It doesn't require that presidential declaration, and it provides for the utilities to describe the situation that they have, and then the operating committee of the Restore program makes a determination to launch the program for that particular instance and start the interaction between the two members, participants, to exchange transformers. Next slide. So there's some information on Restore posted on the NATF's public site under the Programs tab there. There's some example screenshots of those documents. And then for Restore members, there's some additional information, non-public information, that is posted on the transport site under industry initiatives, and there's a Restore program tab under that tab on the transport homepage. Next slide. So as noted, Restore is only available to NATF members. You can contact us and we can start the process. It's fairly simple to do. There's a joinder agreement to the Restore sharing agreement, and then there's a supplement to the NATF member agreement that are two primary forms to be executed to become a member. Next slide. So shifting gears to some other resilience-related topics. So supply chain is an important and very broad topic that we've been working on since 2016 and in early 2017. In response to a NERC Board of Trustees resolution in August of 2017, we made a decision internal to the NATF and our board to conduct a lot of the supply chain activities in an open fashion involving other industry players as well as suppliers, industry trade groups and forums, third-party assessment organizations and solution providers to really establish and publish best practices around supply chain risk risk management. And that's resulted in a large suite of resources that have been made available to industry as a whole to help build out a strong supply chain risk management program. So you see the timeline here, all on up into June of 2020. We actually have updated the model criteria and questionnaire as recently as June of 2021. Next slide. So when we first started our activities around supply chain, these were our key objectives. And first and foremost, we wanted to make sure we identify superior practices for identifying and addressing risk introduced via the supply chain. And secondly, it was important to establish industry convergence on approaches on achieving those security objectives in order to also be efficient and effective in how supply chain risk management was conducted by industry as a whole and suppliers, and to ensure that the best practices around security and supply chain would also meet the expectations of the supply chain standards that have been implemented by the Electric Reliability Organization. Next slide. So to that end, the NATF established a strategy for our activities, and largely around three pillars, for lack of a better word. First of all, adoption of the model that we've created with the industry input, industry and our industry partners' input, to build that convergence on the approaches. And so we've done a number of things to help promote the adoption of the model. More recently, looking to enlist support from the ERO enterprise and NERC in the form of getting endorsement of the NATF model criteria and questionnaire as sufficient tools to meet compliance obligations under the reliability standards. Additionally, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we want to gain value for our members, and so we continue to develop practices within the membership, look at developing some venues for confidential discussions within the membership on supply chain topics. And then lastly, in order to help build out some of that efficiency and effectiveness and convergence, coordinating with other organizations that are also looking to develop practices and criteria around supply chain risk management to ensure alignment of those across the different platforms that are being developed. Next slide. So this is a partial list of some of the key accomplishments and activities that have been conducted by the NATF and with industry on supply chain. And then the second panel there, the supply chain security assessment model is kind of the foundational piece that we're using that incorporates a set of criteria to assess supply chain security, supplier security practices, and then a questionnaire to flesh out that information or to gather that information. And then we have an annual review and update process to keep those current and get industry input on those. We also have conducted the industry organizations team to develop, that consists of the trades, the forums, the suppliers, third-party assessors. That group meets periodically to help continue to identify opportunities for improvement and develop new resources. And then aligning with other industry groups on other products. And there are a few examples there of what's been done in that venue. Next slide. So our current areas of focus on supply chain is to develop a set. One of those is to develop a set of principles of operating excellence for supply chain. We have those in a lot of our other technical areas within the NATF. Has established a set of attributes of what a good program looks like. So that work is just starting and looking to build on that ultimately over time to incorporate them into peer reviews in the future. We're also currently conducting a update and a revision of the 2013 supply chain implementation guidance that was endorsed by the ERO as a way to meet compliance with SIP 13. We're updating that to incorporate the model and the criteria in the questionnaire, and working to get that endorsed as well to further the convergence on those resources. There's another document, the white paper that we produced in response to the NERC BOT request, is being updated to refresh it, to bring it up to current practices. And then a key recent activity is around development of a central repository for supplier security information that will help provide a one-stop shop for utilities to go to get information on suppliers, and for suppliers to feed into to present their information to in one place, rather than getting multiple requests from multiple customers on different types of questions. And then lastly, a practice document around how best to manage a third-party risk management program. Next slide, please. And then we're continuing our calls to enable members to share their experiences with supply chain implementation, updating the criterion questionnaire on a periodic basis. Introductory outreach has been conducted with the Department of Energy and Department of Homeland Security, and we're continuing to coordinate with the EISAC, Epri, and NERC. And then we have our supply chain steering team and the industry organization team meetings that are going on each week. Next slide. So shifting to another, I'll go back to, well, let me stop and pause. There was a question in the chat if the NATF was going to have discussions around other supply chain issues around shortage of critical materials, and that could become a concern for grid security and reliability. Not directly, but I'm sure those discussions will come into some of the meetings that we'll have. The focus on supply chain just generally has broadened from just a focus on cybersecurity into more equipment-related supply chain issues. But in terms of some of those materials that you hear about are getting harder to come by. No specific discussions, but that certainly is part of the equation, because it could have an impact on reliability. So next slide, just a quick update on some work that's underway, beginning actually within the NATF on grid transformation. This is a topic that is one of the 4 key risk profiles reported on in the ERO's Reliability Issues Steering Committee report. And it's one that our members have indicated is of high interest and importance to the NATF. So we're within staff and within some of the expertise in staff and with some of our members' input, we're working on a framework on how to kind of guide our efforts around grid transformation, and particularly the impact of variable energy resources on the grid. So we're classifying activities that we either currently have underway or that we may conduct in the future in the six key areas that you see below. And there'll be more to come on this, because we're just starting to flesh out some of the processes and how we might go about doing that, doing these discussions and activities. And we'll be bringing this to our board in the December meeting and to our program advisory groups to get input from our member leadership. Next slide. So a piece that you may have seen on the previous slide, one piece of that grid transformation is related to Black Start practices, and it's an activity that has recently started to develop a set of practices around Black Start restoration, and in particular focusing on how grid transformation will impact how you think about Black Start going forward. So we're looking to develop that work and publish it in the second quarter of 2022. and you can see the topics that we're planning on covering in that group. So, again, more to come on that, but wanted to highlight that this is an area that we're working on within the NATF, and I think it offers some good opportunity with Epri, because we understand that Epri has quite a few activities and projects underway in Black Star planning. Next slide. So that's all I have for an overview. I'll look to see if there are any other questions. I don't see any more in the chat currently, but do have a little bit of time for any questions that anyone may have on what we're doing within the NATF on resilience. Okay. Well, not seeing any. I will now turn it over to Kevin Barrett from Epri to share with us the many activities that Epri has underway in resilience. Kevin?
Excellent. Quick sound check. You hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can.
Delayed pause there had me scared for a second. So welcome, everybody. Happy to be back in the saddle again, working with NATF and talking about resilience. So that's something we've been passionate about working together on for a long time. So as I was pulling these slides together, which is going to cover multiple project updates, kind of like Ken just did, just going through a lot of different activities that we have going on, an image struck me about Epri. So next slide. So with apologies to Siri, this kind of mental image came into my head as I was putting these slides together. There's a lot of help and a lot of answers out there that Epri can provide and NATF can provide. And just like Siri sometimes the answer is, I don't know, but we can go and we can find out, and that's an important. So kind of one of the takeaways that I want everyone to get from this presentation this afternoon is, need to ask, be engaged, and take action. And in many ways, I'm kind of preaching the choir here with this group if you're on this call, but it's still important. Next slide. So next 20, 30 minutes or so, I'm going to try to weave a story and kind of patch all these together, a lightning round fashion going through 11 resilience-related projects. There's a lot more out there, and we wanted to focus on these. Almost all of them are in transmission. Some of them are a little outside the transmission area. Each of them could have been their own session, and I know Randy and Aiden and Jen and some others are going to be talking later. So we just wanted to share a little bit, and if you have more information, I'll be happy to get you linked up with the project managers and deliverables and other things like that as needed. So some of these I know a lot about, and some of them I actually run. Some of them I know a little bit about. Some of them I learned as I was putting these slides together. So I will answer the questions that I can, and my answer might be, I don't know, but I'll get you an answer. And I do want to take a quick second just to thank and recognize all of my hardworking Epri colleagues. Again, it was easier for me to kind of cover these in a lightning fashion versus trying to have people sign on and cover all these in depth. Next slide. We're going to start off with two of my projects, first one being physical security. If you take a look at this infographic that kind of uses as our model, you can see, again, there's a lot going on. We look at kind of two-pronged approach. What are the different threats out there? Physical, ballistics, break-ins, drone threats, even IMI, the Havana syndrome, some different things that are out there, as well as insider threats. Definitely something we need to be thinking about. And then, you look at all that Epri does on the asset side for, transformers and circuit breakers, all the other equipment out there. Same sort of thing on the physical security side, intrusion detection systems, cameras. There's a lot we need to acquire, maintain, operate, and dispose of. And then theft, quite frankly, is also a major issue. So that's something we try to work on. And really, it's about identifying, creating, and transferring that value. What are the pain points? How do we address it? How can Epri use its resources for R&D to try to help? So it's interesting when you work with security, you got to find this right balance between, oh no, the sky's falling, and sticking your head in the sand like an ostrich and pretending like it won't happen to me. Normally the answer is somewhere in the middle, and we try to strike that right chord. So a lot going on Next slide. This is just some of the pictures. I went back some of my old slide decks and pulled a few out there. Just got to highlight some of the work we've been doing. You see there, the one upper left-hand corner is ballistics. That's what one overhead conductor looks like when you are going through some ballistic training. You can see there the red arrow shows the direction of travel for the projectile there. Just this week, EISAC put out a report about an incident on a 500 kV line. I was actually on the phone this morning talking to the utility, trying to get some more information about it. Could we get a sample of it, do some forensics? We couldn't in this case, but that is something that we could do for security or for other needs. Picture in the middle there, that's a concrete wall. One of the benefits of Epri, third-party, unbiased, trust but verify. Learn some things when you're doing inspections. What can we expect when we go through something like this? Upper right-hand corner, that's our field guide. Something physically they can have in their hands, throw it in their back pocket, throw it in the truck, the toolbox. Anybody do not need to be a physical security expert and take a flip through this and do a quick kind of a site survey and take a look at the status at any location. And then kind of the lower left and lower right-hand corners, you look at intrusion detection, going through fencing. Some of you might recognize the Boston Dynamics robot Spot. We had that up in our LUDX facility earlier this year, ran through some paces and trying to build, the business case. How will this work? How do we integrate? How do we adopt that type of new technology into a utility environment? Next slide. Speaking of Linux, some of you may or may not know, we've been working on a counter UAS project for several years now. One of the great advantages Epri has at Linux Lab is we can simulate safely a utility environment. Project funders, we could invite them there to be observers as we're working with the vendors, as we're setting up and kind of kicking the tires, so to speak, and learning how some of this technology works. And we can include high voltage, corona, arcing, high current fields, a lot of metal enclosures, and see how does acoustics and radar and RF type of devices work in that type of environment. A quick caveat before anybody asks, I'll have them off the pass. We are doing the detect and identify portions of counter UAS. We are not doing the interdiction portions of counter UAS yet. I would love to. We're keeping our finger on the pulse of that. We talked to vendors about that, but we have not actually tested any of that yet. So phase 2 is ending. I hope to have, well, not hope, I will have a report out by the end of the year, and we're looking at our options for phase 3, talking to other vendors. We've worked with the Air Force in the past, and we'll see where that goes from there. Next slide. So almost in the same breath, as soon as you think of physical security and over cybersecurity is right behind it. There is definitely a nexus between the two. So we'll start talking about intrusion detection, badge reader, physical security, cybersecurity, and that link. So reach out to some of our friends there. And this one is called RISE, R-H-I-S-E, is the acronym. Responding to high impact cybersecurity events. This is one of the projects they have ongoing. If you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a list of names for the contacts, but also you'll notice they're coming from all different areas. So PDU, power delivery and utilization, the transmission area, generation, grid ops and planning, distribution. So Epri can bring together a lot of assets internally when we're working on these projects. So this particular one is looking into some best practices for OT, IT, OT interface for operational technology. This is more about isolating equipment, coming up with a response playbook. If something happens, what do we do? Exercises, identifying gaps, sharing issues, and sometimes we identify something and say, hey, you know what, Epri, we need to take a deeper dive on something we didn't even think about before. We'll go out and do that. So a lot of good work going on there. Next slide. Also in the cyber security space, they are looking ahead, down the road, 2030 vision of what OT cybersecurity might be looking like. How do we define future states? What should we be thinking about? Looking at the crystal ball, reading those tea leaves, what do we think we need to do? And then working backwards to come up with a gap analysis. How do we get there? What are our capabilities? What's missing? What do we need to go out, and kind of invent? How do we address those gaps? Even decarbonization. It's a little hard to read on the screen. It's a little hard to read on my screen. I'm staring right at it in a big monitor. You can see there over the right-hand side, there's actually a meeting for the project a week from today. There's a contact info if hopefully some of you on the call are involved in this project, or if you have any questions, you can reach out to them as well. Next slide. So keeping things moving, I'm going to jump to communications. Brett from UTC mentioned this, kind of was stealing the thunder a little bit and kind of gave you a sneak peek behind the curtain about 6 gigahertz, which I will freely admit I did not know a lot about. I was just getting ready to, the 5 gigahertz and the 4 LTE on my phones at home. So, I learned from Brett yesterday, that in the grand scheme of things, the utility communications are actually in many ways, they have advantages and disadvantages, but in many ways they're actually better and stronger than some of the commercial communication links out there, which I hadn't really thought of before. So Tim Godfrey and others have been busy at work. You can see there, working with Ameren, Southern, and others in the last year or two, actually out in the field doing testing, taking these equipment out there and finding out some answers, looking at the issues, figuring out how the industry can help address them. Getting technically unbiased, basis and facts that can be used, then whether it's for someone wants to talk to the regulator, their PUC, their CSO, CIO, whatever the case might be, that is one of the values that Epri can try to share with others and try to raise that awareness. Next slide. So here's kind of the Cliff Notes version. Some of the things that have been found so far with this Epri research on this project. I'm not going to read them out loud to you. You can skim through them right now. We have included links as well. We mentioned we'll share these slides with you afterwards to some of the Epri reports that are available. If you want to go look at those technical reports, you can do that as well. And Tim tells me that the research will be continuing into 2022 as well. So stand by for more news. Still a lot developing out there, but definitely something that should be on your radar scope if it's not already. Next slide. So yesterday, Tony from Southern Cal talked about fires and some of their experiences there. Doug Dorr, Joe Potvin, and others have been doing a lot of really good work for Epri looking into these type of issues. This specifically, these next 2 slides are going to be focusing on wildfires. Kind of the 2 key takeaways I wanted to highlight on this call. One, kind of focus on resilient infrastructure and the right of ways and what can be done there. Again, which kind of dovetails with what Tony was talking about. You can kind of see there the pictures over on the right-hand side, some of the aging tests, conductor contact tests, again, using our facilities up in Lenox and elsewhere to do some of this testing. Interestingly, and a little scary, you see the picture in the lower left-hand corner of that group of 4 about flammability and thermal stability tests. It's interesting, a little scary, that unknowingly many utilities are actually increasing the risk out on their system because they're putting guards out on the network that is actually highly flammable. And until we run these tests, and I forget how many dozens Joe and others have done to see, hey, this stuff, gets a fault through it. Not only does it not extinguish, it keeps burning and dripping, liquid parts and creates bigger problems. So the knowledge of being aware of that is on your system. What are some comparisons, contrasts of what to buy and what to put out there? That can be helpful as well. And then also the fast detection and response. Tony was talking about that. A lot of the opportunity they see is in the power distribution versus the transmission side of business, but they're going to keep working on that, focusing on assets, life cycle performance, and system design. Next slide. So how do we do that? You know, fast detection and response. One of the ways what these slides are trying to show is examples of combining AI with some cameras and seeing how do we use this technology, how do we adapt it, how can we use it better. This is coming out of Epri's TI, Technology Innovation Program. And they're working with some different vendors to try to figure out how can they more efficiently detect and then geolocate with today's technology. Hey, there's something over here. Make sure we send up the alarm so we know about what's going on there. So lots of good work to help people. Next slide. Talking about GMD, we're lucky. I get to work alongside kind of the dream team. Got Bob Eric, Charles Perry, Luke Vanderzell, a lot of good experts here at Epri focusing on this. I can barely spell GMD, and they're crunching the numbers and figuring out all the good things. Epri has many different tools in the tool bucket, ways that we can address projects. Sometimes it could be supplemental project to focus on something. It could be an annual research type project that we keep working on over and over again. We could do a one-off with DOE, National Science Foundation, NASA. Sometimes you'll go up and help NERC address some of FERC's questions. So Andrew Phillips was talking yesterday, and his leadership over the last 10 years, maybe 20 years, I'm not exactly sure how long we've been working on this, with sensors and the GIC monitoring and some of the sensors we have. The rightmost picture on this slide shows one of the sensors on top of a high voltage transmission conductor. So, that didn't exist, and Epri was able to come up and figure out how to do that. So good work going on there. A quick reminder as I'm checking my notes, if you are part of the Sunburst project, next week, Tuesday, is the meeting. It's for project funders only, but just a reminder, if your company is part of the project and you want to be involved or get involved, make sure you reach out to Charles to get more information on that. Next slide. So what are they doing now in GMD? Keeping busy, certainly not done. More stuff to discover, understand, model, harmonic and thermal analysis, always a challenge. Taking our models, we build it. Hey, having a model is better than no model, but as we all know, all models are wrong. Some of them are useful. So how do you make the models better? You validate them, go back and figure that out. And I mentioned the compliance piece and working with NERC and some of the FERC orders. So this work will help with TPL 007 as it gets finished and published. Next slide. As you saw with GMD, a lot of the work that Epri does is not one and done. It's ongoing. It continues as we are working on things, discover new things, try to improve. This is from Pierre Marais. He actually presented on this a couple of years ago at one of our resilience summits. So this is kind of the update and the continuation of some of the work he was doing. This is specifically addressing transmission towers and the risk of cascading failures. It doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it's a bad day for everybody. How can we try to mitigate this, understand this, avoid this? Epri has developed a tool for that, even though most design codes don't require a load case. So click once. There should be a build here. Thank you. So we have what's called the case software. Basically, it evaluates how will this propagate, number of towers that will be affected. Is there a way that the utility can go in and strengthen up one of the towers, pre-position assets, expect where something's going to fail, that sort of thing. Next slide. So obviously this need still exists, and Pierre is doing work actually applying the case, and you see the acronym there, the case software with various utilities on actual lines to understand more about what is the risk, what is the threat, how to mitigate it, what can we do about it. Kind of taking a no regrets approach. Would much rather know about it beforehand and be able to do something about it than, oh no, figure it out afterwards. So that is the intent. That's what's going on here. And next slide. So this one's kind of neat. This is newer in the scheme of things. I don't think we've shared this with the Resilient Summits before because we canceled last year with COVID, or maybe it was just a germ of an idea last time we talked about it. So there's another one of Pierre's projects that I think is pretty slick. It's working on building a kind of a one-stop shop, all-in-one emergency tower kit, so to speak. So I'm going to go through a series of builds here and explain a little bit more. So next slide. So the idea is, oh no, something's happened and we need to rapidly build and repair one of these towers. Whether you have a crane, take this off the truck, and if you have access to the site, or if you need to get a helicopter to pull it in, basically it's taking existing Connex containers and figuring out how can we design all of this, keep it prepackaged inside. So next. Once this thing gets placed where you want it, you start opening up the top. Next slide. One of my projects I work on is safety by design, and I talk to Pierre, learn a lot from him and others about how do we incorporate safety into the design of things, how do we make it better, how do we eliminate and substitute hazards. So it's like, okay, we already know we're going to be working around the top of this thing. What can we do? Well, let's build it so when it folds out, we've got work platforms, we've got guardrails, already just set them up. We've got a ladder and steps and handrails. Thinking ahead of these things in the design as we're putting them in. Next. As far as employing best practices, setting the towers, the guy wires, what do we need to do? What's going to be a good way to try to make this happen? Next. Obviously, you would want to do this before there were any events. You would rig it so it has, compatible with your conductors, compatible with your insulators, includes all the tools, all the ancillary gear. It's all kind of a one-stop shop as this comes in. Next. And then, again, whether it's a helicopter or a crane, you can lift all this up and just kind of like a, just kind of folds in or folds out from itself. The next thing you know, you've got a tower. So I did not realize this until I was putting these slides together. Pierre tells me that just took the learning from the case tool and the study they've been doing there, which we just covered, and are actually taking some of those lessons learned and putting it into this project and its design. Next slide. And this is just a quick idea of what it's going to look like once put together and the different types of options and configurations you have depending on what your need is out in the field. Next slide. Moving on, let's talk ops and planning. So, Ken mentioned there's a need and a lot of work going on at Natf Epri for black start and restoration. Obviously, that's always a challenging area, and we can practice as much as you want, but all of them are going to be somewhat different until it actually happens. So be ready for that. Vikas Singhvi and his teammates have been working on I kind of smile. We call it health. Tom mentioned yesterday, maybe she high impact medium frequency because they seem to be happening more often lately. Working quickly, left to right, the optimal black start capability. They've been working on some new algorithms that your planners can use to help put this together, kind of the best combination of black start units and how you want to have that. I know PGM was talking about that a little bit yesterday as well. What type of metrics and even non-critical loads. And we talked about, hey, the hospitals and the water treatment plants, got to have those up. I agree. How does that factor into voltage control? How does that factor into, the load generation balance? Also something we need to be thinking about. In the middle there, you see the system restoration navigator using kind of the GIS capabilities. They want to track the restoration as it's going. Is it on track? Do we need to call an audible and change something while it's going on? And I learned we can import EMS cases for real-time support in that tool as it's going through. And Crank Prot, not Crank Pot, is another new tool that they're working on. Short circuit paths. And as you see there, they've already tried it in CAPE, one of the planning softwares that they try to use. Next slide. Almost done. I think one or two more to go. So this one, if you were here yesterday for Arshad's keynote address, he was talking about many of the changes that are coming. Obviously, decarbonization, greenhouse gases. It's going to impacts all industries, all critical infrastructure. So this project is taking a look at how some of that might play out. Gil and David from the DOE mentioned the NARM and their modeling. So again, this is trying to take a look at, okay, what does it mean for us and what does it mean for other parts of society? This is a white paper that is pending. It will be released. As of the last update I have, it was not released yet. I haven't checked today. It might be out there now, but it will be out this month. And kind of look at some of the different strategies and okay, what do we need to do now, starting now, to help us get to 2030 and where we want to be. Other white papers will be following on once that one comes out, looking at things, again, like Arsha had mentioned, nuclear uprates, transmission corridors, skilled labor and training needs, and what can EPRI do for that? An EPRI for transmission, for training, and EPRI University. So a lot of options there. Next slide. Okay, last topic. So we're almost there. So about 2 or 3 years now, some folks have been working on this. Laura Fisher, Sarah Mullen-Trento, Delvine Diaz, Morgan Scott, some others. And RSIF is kind of the acronym that we've been throwing around, Resilient System Investment Framework. Hey, Kevin, great ideas. We got all this stuff. How much is it going to cost? Where do I get maximum bang for the buck? How do I explain this to, when I'm making my rate case, I'm talking to the PUC, when I'm talking to customers, somebody's got to pay for all this. What do we need to do? As well as an aspect that we haven't talked too much about, what about the community side? I think it was Dan Smith mentioned yesterday, kind of the storm after the storm. How do we prepare for that? What can we do to help mitigate some of those issues? So kind of like the NAR model, you've got your different assessments you can do, take those inputs, put it in here, run through different scenarios, come up with your ideas, come up with your answers, and then try to go apply that. Next slide. So again, I probably sound like a broken record at this point, trying to tie in and piggyback what a lot of others have said yesterday. The climate predictions and the changes we see happening moving forward, taking this framework and trying to interpret those, read the tea leaves and help you make better decisions with some type of technical basis and looking into this and sharing best practices, not just, pulling a number out of thin air. So with that, my last slide, and I'll end early. EPRI and NTF, I'll end as I began. A ton of work going on. You heard Ken. You got a snapshot of some of the work that's been going on at EPRI. Your 3 takeaways, a lot of work out there. Stay engaged, ask for help, identify those gaps. Maybe we've got the solution sitting on the shelf or a white paper. Maybe we don't. Maybe we need to go out and do it. But working together, we're going to accomplish more. And then really that bottom line, no pun intended there, that I have in blue. Resilience doesn't happen by accident. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but very important, continuing to see the need, see the incidence of these, is it a 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100? Is it 1 in 50, 1 in 20 year type event? Sometimes we have to scratch your head and we kind of wonder. So with that, I'll say thank you. And again, I'll be happy to answer questions if I can and link you up with any of these project managers or deliverables as needed. Ken, back to you.
Hey, great. Thank you, Kevin. A lot of good material there and information. I did send you a question in the chat.
I saw it. It threw me in like, oh, yeah, I can do that. I saw it. We'll post some of that information.
So Kevin will put a link to the Bullet Strike article in the chat for people to grab if you're interested in that. Other questions for Kevin, or if anybody thought of questions for me on the NATF activities? Okay, well, not seeing any questions. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but we're going to stick with our 15-minute break time. So we'll reconvene at 20 minutes after the hour, and Lena Estep will cover lessons learned from resilience activities. Be back 20 minutes after the hour. Hi, Aiden. Welcome. I see you've joined. Can we get a quick mic check for you, please? Not hearing you yet.
Okay.
There it is. Can you
Yes,
say something
you can hear me
again?
okay?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
better. Thank you.
can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Just a quick reminder, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope everybody had a good short break there. So we'll get back to our session today, and starting with a overview of some lessons learned from resilience activities presented by Lena Estep of NATF staff. Lena?
All right, thanks, Ken. Hi, everybody. I'm Lena Estep. As Ken said, I'm from NATF staff, and I work in the initiatives area, do a lot of work in resilience. So I'm very happy to be here today. The good thing about being able to be towards the end of the agenda is that you hear all these great speakers ahead of you and all these threads that are, tie right into the things that you're going to present, so that feels good. The bad part of it is you have to follow these great speakers. So we'll do our best to get through these today. Some of you may have heard some of this before in some form because I have given this some form of this in a couple of other venues. We have a couple of new things to show you, but just bear with me and be glad to answer questions at the end, and hopefully we'll give you guys some good takeaways today. Next slide. So very quickly, I do want to do a little level setting with you. So if you're not familiar with the Transmission Resilience Maturity Model, I will give you a quick background, and Ken covered some of that. So I'll go through that pretty quickly and then get to the main event, right? Those learnings that folks are probably most interested in. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, history and some basics. Go on to the next one. So very quickly, and Ken covered some of this, but I think it's important to just make sure that you guys understand that this was a collaborative effort. It was NATF, Epri, DOE, and Pacific Northwest National Labs working together. And so it wasn't just NATF and Epri staff either sitting in those rooms developing the model. We had some really great experts, subject matter experts from our membership sitting in the room with us. So it was a great collaborative effort to get to where we are today. We started that journey, a couple of years back now, and I feel like we've made a lot of progress, ended up with a model that we put out as version 1 in 2020, about this time, coming up on our 1-year anniversary. I hadn't thought about that before. And since have done not only the pilots to help us get to that final version, but have also started doing some ongoing assessments with our members to help them go through the model, step through that with them. So just a lot of good work from that. And that's really where the majority of our learnings are coming from today, having those great conversations with the members. Next slide. So if you aren't familiar, I mentioned the collaborative effort. The great thing about this model was it was built on some existing capabilities as far as just the framework. Once we got PN&L on board, they were a great resource and had already done work on the C2M2. That's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, if you're familiar with that. And so we were able to leverage that framework, putting our spin for resilience into the practices that make up that model. We did ours proactively, so I feel like we've really shown leadership on resilience for the industry. And the great thing was we weren't under these any kind of time constraints, so we could be deliberate. We could make those changes that we needed to and do it kind of on our timeline. The other thing I think is really great about this, I mentioned the learnings that have come out of it, but it also starts helping us talk the same language. We've heard several folks mention, and this is not the first time, that, we want a definition. We're going to cover some of that here in a minute, but there's other things that have to go into that common understanding of what we're talking about when we're trying to get our arms around resilience and resilience events. So the model makes, I think, great strides in doing that for us. And then this has been mentioned, right? There's, it does offer the opportunity for some trending and benchmarking. It's not what I would consider, specific, threat-specific kinds of metrics, but it is a start for us to kind of look at our posture, different organizations' postures and in resilience, and then be able to kind of look at each other and learn from each other. And we have made some of those connections already, starting those good conversations from folks that have maybe been on the front lines of some things that others haven't and have already had to start solving some of these problems. So I think it's a really healthy thing that, journey that we're on right now. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the model is made up of a number of practices. There's over 300, so that's, is quite a bit there. It is more of a high-level view of resilience. We're not getting into threat-specific things. We try to be as much threat agnostic as possible. But you can see here where we've kind of got things broken out into what we're calling domains. They're really the key elements. So those bullets on the right-hand side are the 9 key elements or domains that the practices are organized in. I like to think of it as the old planner in me. I kind of like to think of it with the structure there in the triangle. So we start out with kind of that high-level look, the overall program management. We have a domain dedicated to that. And then we get into that longer-term planning time frame where you do your risk analysis and do some hardening, all those different things that are going to take some time to implement, and so that you position yourself well for any event that comes your way. We all know that in the shorter term and real-time time frame that it's just vitally important to have great plans and processes, including that situational awareness piece. So those are 2 domains there, and then just several that are cross-cutting. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we talk about the learnings, but just wanted to give you guys an idea of how the model itself is organized. Next slide. And just as a teaser, talking a little bit high level there about what the model is all about, I did want to give you guys some graphics and give you an idea of what's possible out of the model. So if you haven't had a chance to visit, there is a dedicated website for this tool. It is accompanied by a lot of supporting documentation. If you use the tool, you'll see that there's just a wealth of information and visualizations that are at your fingertips. And just looking at that bottom graphic, you can kind of get a feel for what we're going for there, right? Reds are possible areas for improvement. Greens are places where you're doing a little bit better. And so just very quick visually, you can get an idea of where there might be some opportunities for you to work on. So we'll get into more of those a little bit later as far as where some of those things that we saw trending across multiple entities came into play. And you can see across the top there, there's all the domains that we were talking about on the previous slide. All right, next slide. All right, so this is the main event, right? Let's dive into the learnings. Go ahead to the next slide. And just so you guys know, we are planning to, for our NATF members, put out a bulletin that has a lot of this information and more in a nice, concise document for you. That should be coming pretty soon. We don't have an exact date on that, but it will be coming before the end of the year. Again, I mentioned that it's great to follow some really good speakers and hear their messages, and I'm just going to ride their coattails here. So I know Tom and others talked yesterday about, trying to get your arms around that, what is resilience? And I think the reason that we struggle on this sometimes is that it is not like reliability where we can, we've not only have a lot more runtime on it, but we also have a pretty good definition of what that means to us. With resilience, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Really, there's a lot of factors that go into that, and for each organization, it's really a different thing for them. It really depends on your threat landscape. What threats have you seen? What do you expect to come your way? If you've had more events that have happened to you, so your historical experience, what we saw is that those folks are a little bit further on the maturity scale because they've had to be. There's nothing like learning because you have to. You learn a lot, but the better way to do that is to actually learn from those that had to go through it so you don't have to experience it firsthand. And that's what we really want to try to get to the members is all that great information so that we can share that and you don't have to experience it yourself. As I mentioned, folks that are on the there's different threats for different locations, different postures with your company philosophy, what kinds of loads that you have to serve. Some examples are, if you're on the Gulf Coast, you know a lot about hurricanes, unfortunately. If you're on the West Coast, as we've heard, you know a lot about wildfires. Depending on where you are, if you're in New York, if you're serving New York City, you've got some very critical loads there, a big load center that is kind of too big to fail. So a lot of pressures there from a regulatory and societal aspect. Same thing, again, kind of going back to the Gulf Coast and thinking about all the oil and gas infrastructure. So just lots of variables there, and I think that's one of the reasons we're struggling. The other thing, to get our one definition, but I also think it's, we're still on this journey. We're still learning, and so resilience is a lot newer than reliability to us. So I think we're making really good strides. Next slide. All right, so you guys saw this from Tom's presentation yesterday. I will just highlight one example here I like to go through. As he mentioned, we kind of think of this in shades of gray, if you will. So reliability is on the far left, resilience on the far right, and there's shades of each in between. So if you look at the yellow dots at the bottom, if you think about just you lose a transformer, whether it's from vandalization or if it's something else, then that's N-1. So that's pretty clearly reliability. When we start thinking about, something a little more coordinated, affecting more than one piece of equipment, like the Metcalf event, then you start moving to the right on that continuum. And an even more extreme scenario that we can think of in that same vein is something where if they were even more sophisticated and were able to get a coordinated attack on multiple critical substations, then and take out bulk electric facilities, then that would go even further towards the resilience side of that continuum. And I think the takeaway for me here is twofold. One is, as Tom mentioned, it's kind of degrees of magnitude, right? So on the right-hand side, you're talking about larger impacts to not only the area, the geographical area, but also to your equipment. The other thing is that longer duration. We've seen that play out a couple of times lately. As you get further and further out, your assumptions have to change as to what's available to you. So that thinking about that, the larger impacts and the longer durations really is an important thing for you when you're talking about resilience. That does not mean that we're throwing away all the great stuff that we're doing to respond to hurricanes and to respond to storms that come through, right? All that stuff may have a flavor of both reliability and resilience, but as we really think more on that right-hand side, we're going to learn even more about resilience. And I think the next slide will show that a little bit more. I mentioned trying to get our arms around a definition, and maybe there's not one. So if you kind of look at this and you see the different kind of buckets there that I have kind of denoted with the dotted lines, there's five buckets, right? And so this is really trying to draw the analogy between what you just saw on the previous slide and that continuum, so a version of that down at the bottom, and the phases of the moon. So if we have a new moon, you really don't even know that moon is there, right? So same thing for reliability. If you're only looking at reliability events, you're not really uncovering what the impacts, what the risks are to a resilience event. As you move further and further to the right-hand side, as the phases of the moon, as it waxes to full, you're going to uncover more and more and discover more and more about what a resilience event can do to you. So if you'll click one time, Jamie, I think that'll highlight what we want to talk about. Like I mentioned, it's not that the other buckets are not important, but those are things that historically we know about. And so those are things that we have good plans and processes in place already because we've been forced into that. Where we really need to start thinking and begin to stress test our processes and our plans is when we talk about those high impact, low frequency, or maybe medium frequency, as I've heard earlier, events on that right-hand side. And so you start getting into those more exotic events as you get there. And I know a lot of folks think, oh, we'll never get there, but there's some important things that will come out of an exercise if you just think about that, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to solve all those problems, but it's a great way to stress test your processes. Next slide. This is kind of just a recap of what I said. You don't want to just look at historical events. You have to spread a wide net, and you might not want to look at just what's historical for you. You probably want to look at nationally or even worldwide what's happening, right? So there's going to be folks that have started experiencing things that you haven't, and you can learn from those. So those are great things to keep on your radar. So just remember, as you start thinking about these things, keep your resilience lens on and really think of things that are more on that right-hand side, those high-impact, low-frequency events. Next slide. One of the ways to do this, and I've heard a lot of people kind of talk around this, and this is a term that we have coined in the Transmission Resilience Maturity Model. It's called Design Basis Resilience Events. I hear a lot of people talk about design basis. That's something that we all are familiar with. We put that resilience tag in the name here, and the idea is, hey, it's really a great exercise for you to think about what are some of the reasonable worst case scenarios that you really need to be thinking about for your system, and that helps you understand what to design and plan to. It also helps everybody within your organizations to be thinking about the right severity of events. So we just think this is a really good thing for folks to start thinking about. We know it's a new concept. NATF is going to start thinking about this, how we can help the membership think about these and maybe come up with some templates or some examples as to what this might look like. And as I mentioned, it could be a suite of these, right? Because there may not be just one type of event that would cover everything you need to, but that way you start that conversation with everybody level set that, hey, this is the level of severity we were talking about. This is the type of event. This is these are the impacts, and this is the longevity of it. So we think this is a really good thing to start the conversation. Next slide. So I've kind of covered some of that here. You've heard it yesterday, so I'll hit this really quickly with the punchline. If you're only thinking about severe weather events, then we don't think that you're including adequate scope for resilience. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You need to really do that deep dive for your organization. Think about what it means for you for reliability versus resilience, and make sure that all of your groups are singing from the song sheet music, because you need to all be thinking about the right level of severity to stress test your processes and plans. So again, that design basis resilience event comes into play. Next slide. The second thing that we wanted to bring to your attention as far as a learning is we really feel like resilience program management is very important. We've talked to a few organizations that we think are doing a really great job as far as managing the whole instead of managing pieces. And as I kind of stepped back and thought about it after we talked to several of the folks that went through the assessments with us, it really feels a lot like what we went through with compliance 15 plus years ago. If you'll remember, if you were in the industry at that point, compliance was new, and so groups would organically kind of pop up to within their groups to handle compliance issues. Put out those fires, if you will, for the compliance questions that would come through. And, it was really not all that organized in the beginning. And as we moved through time, the transmission business usually came up with a organized group. And then, even beyond that, the whole enterprise, in a lot of instances now, have a compliance group that helps oversee all that. That doesn't mean that the work isn't still done by the subject matter experts as it's needed, but you've got someone with visibility, someone or a group with visibility to all that's going on. There's some efficiencies to be gained there, right? So just a lot of stuff to think about as far as managing the whole versus managing the pieces, and we would highly recommend that that's probably the wave of the future. As you see there on the right-hand graphic, I think Ken mentioned it a little bit earlier, we are working on a resilience program roadmap to help folks understand what are the pieces of that program that you need in order to be successful. So that is something that's coming soon as well. We're working on that. We have the graphic, and we'll be putting together a practice document that explains each piece of that. One piece that I think is just really important to call out on this that you might not think about is the resilience culture. And I think that's just really fundamental to this whole thing, because we need not only awareness, but we need understanding across all of your organization, as well as from your C-suite down to the worker level. Everybody needs to know what when we're talking about resilience. What do we mean? So there's that awareness and training that needs to happen, and all of that's kind of part of that building that culture. And again, another analogy, right, is how folks have been building in safety culture or human performance improvement types of cultures into their organizations. It feels like this could follow in those footsteps. So that's something that's really important to us. We wanted to highlight. Next slide. The third area that we have found, as we have talked to the folks that have gone through the model, is there are some opportunities in your risk assessment processes. First, there is the need, and it doesn't mean that everyone's not doing this, but there feels like there is some gap that the transmission business needs to fill. There's very often, or almost always, an enterprise risk management process, and so that gives you one level of detail, right? But when you step down to the transmission business and think about that risk process, there's some opportunity there, not only if you have a process for alignment with the enterprise, and making sure that as we really start thinking about resilience, that we're pushing the feedback from the transmission risk process up to the enterprise, and making sure that folks understand just how big some of these issues are for us and therefore the enterprise. But also, making sure that you have risk, the resilience piece built into your risk processes. So some of that's going to be inherent, but just really holistically thinking about it, we found there were some gaps, and it feels like there's some big opportunities there for folks to improve their risk management piece. So next slide. Family care plans. This was something that was really interesting. We had a member of our development team for the TRMM that was from a Gulf Coast organization, and they were pretty strongly proposing that we include this in the model, and we ended up doing it. And I'm so glad that we listened to them, because they've lived through a lot of big storms and longer duration events than most people, than most organizations. So they had found it very, very important to make sure that not only are you providing that support, which is basic for your workforce, right? That's something that everybody does, and you want to have a safe environment as much as possible, and give them the support that they need as they're doing the restoration work. But oftentimes, and Dan Smith mentioned it yesterday, as you're going through an event as an employee, you've also got that worry in your mind of your family's welfare, right? So if you have an event that affects not just the transmission system, but also society, then you're going to have some impacts to your workers' families. And so it's really, really important to care of your workers in that way as well by caring for their families during these extreme events. It not only provides them peace of mind, but as the duration goes on, right, it supports their willingness to come to work. If they feel like that their family is taken care of because some of the things that you guys are doing and providing as part of your family care plan, then that means that they're more willing to come to work for you. And it really is that, and you know, being able to come to work with a peace of mind, that's going to make it a safer work environment. You don't have your employees, you know, thinking and worrying about other things. So we just feel like this is a really important thing to highlight. Next slide, please. So we talked about situational awareness a minute ago as far as a really, really important thing for your short-term and real-time time frame. And that seems pretty basic. Everyone's probably sitting there, Lena, we're situationally aware. We have to, the standards say we have to be, but this is actually another step beyond just operations type situational awareness. What we're proposing here is that there's some silos of different types of situational awareness information, right? Obviously, operations is one big piece of that, but you also have cyber and physical security that has information. Telecommunications might have some information. There may be other groups that, you know, you guys need to pull into a common operating picture, and we're using ICS terminology there. We've kind of taken that terminology and expounded that to what we are using in the TRMM to mean, hey, this is a comprehensive picture, and it's something that is not just during events, that you're doing this all the time so that you can be aware of things coming your way, right? There may be things that are clues if you were to take all of these different silos and bring them together and look at them in concert that tell you, hey, there might be something coming at me. And, you know, most often you might think of a cyber type thing for that, because there's I know that cyber's kind of gotten a little bit further out ahead of us as far as predicting things. They can kind of see some stuff coming their way. From the operations perspective, you can see, you know, weather events and things like that. So just making sure that you're looking at that and see if there's some kind of, if you're following reading the tea leaves and seeing, hey, if I'm seeing something happening in a couple of different areas, does that mean that I need to be worried about some kind of simultaneous event coming? Let's see, I saw a note come in. Let me see if I can. All right, so let me get through the rest of these learnings, and we'll go back to the questions, and hopefully some of these will be answered, but we'll get back to that in just a second. So let's go to the next slide. We heard this yesterday. Again, I love it. I feel like a broken record, but it was just great to hear some of the messaging yesterday from the other sectors and the gas subsector. So, you know, we really need to do a good job of identifying our partners and building those relationships before the event. You know, that's the key. You don't want to be picking up the phone and calling these folks in the heat of the moment. So we feel like this is a really important thing that folks need to be thinking about. We heard a couple of folks say we need to do better at identifying all those partners, right? So internal is a lot easier. When you start talking about external partners is where it gets a little more challenging. I think a lot of folks are doing a good job involving all the different types of external partners, government, law enforcement, especially as you use ICS, which is another thing that is baked into the TRMM. It's something that we think is important so that everybody is using the same terminology. But all of these partners are not created equally, right? We heard about some of those critical entities yesterday, those critical loads. And so if you'll go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about those, because it is important to know and identify and build those relationships with everyone, both internally and externally. But there's a certain subset they're really even more, they're a different level of criticality for us. And whatever you call it, I think Chris mentioned critical versus priority. I'm not set on any kind of terminology here. The TRMM uses the term critical entities, and we do define those. But those are the ones, especially with the interdependencies that would have impacts, circular impacts between other areas and our electric system, but also things that are loads that are going to have big impacts to society at large. Those are important as well. So those are the ones that we really need to get our arms around and make sure that we're doing a good job of identifying those and building those relationships. But job one is to identify them, right? And then, as we mentioned, you've got to prioritize them. It's not like one is going to be exactly the same as the other. So even within that most critical list, there's probably going to be some variation, and you might have to make some hard decisions during an event. So as much information as you can have about these loads is going to put you in a much better place. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. So this is one that we think is an important thing for the industry. This is not something that can really be done unilaterally. When you think about the supply chain, when you think about these longer duration events, logically what happens is if you have a larger geographic area that's impacted and it goes on for a long duration, then you're pulling on the same resources for a long time. And so how do those supply chains hold up? So we really think that the way to have better visibility to what would actually happen during a real event is to do some resilience drills and exercises. And this is something that the industry will have to work on together, because we'll need to make sure that we have all the players in the room for this. And that is not just our industry, right? It's going to be our vendors. It's going to be any kind of government agencies, any of the other sectors or subsectors that need to be in on that. And I know there's a lot of drills and exercises that go on, and those are great. Those are a great start, but we do think that there's some room for improvement on trying to stress test these supply chains, because over and over we heard folks say, yeah, we've got great agreements with our vendors, but I guarantee that your neighbors do as well. So we need to make sure that they understand what might be expected of them, and we need to just understand what the repercussions might be if all of us call on it at the same time. What we might be thinking about is from the NATF perspective is thinking about what those drills might look like. So more to come on that, but just wanted to highlight that for you. I think that's something that we can work on together. Next slide. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I teased you with the visuals, but we do think that even though as we are on the journey to defining resilience metrics, that we have some process-oriented metrics that we can leverage just by virtue of the TRMM. So we have started that, started thinking about that at NATF, and we've been working with the folks that have done an assessment, and we are building a dashboard. So if you'll go to the next slide, this is just a start, and just again, this is just some preliminary types of things that we're thinking about, but we really feel like that this is a great venue to do this. I know that we've talked about all of there's not just one size fits all on resilience, so we're not we don't feel like there should be any kind of mandate of, hey, you need to be at X level. But this helps start that conversation, right? If you see where you are in the as far as your scoring, and you can see another neighbor that maybe is doing a little bit better, that starts a conversation. It tells you who to go have that conversation with. So that gives us an idea of who our experts are in the different areas, and then we can start those conversations and, learn from that. Maybe there's an area where everyone needs a little bit of help. So that would allow us to pinpoint what those areas are, and maybe that then kicks off some kind of activity either within Natf or Epri or whatever. So this is just a start. Nothing has been decided on exactly what we're doing here, but we're playing with the numbers right now, and we do think that there's some opportunities to help the membership with that. All right, next slide, please. So I think that I'll just close with my, the whole idea here, and you've probably heard me mentioning it multiple times, right? It's resilience it's hard to get our arms around it. We're still on that journey, and so it really is the long game, right? So we just want to continually move us in the right direction. One of the things that you guys can do, if you use the TRMM or whether you don't, you really need to do that strategic exercise to see what your priorities are when it comes to resilience, because you're not going to be able to solve everything. You're not going to be able to focus on everything. So it really is a journey. We feel like there's a multi-year strategy that everyone should have, and prioritize the things that you think are most important to you as an organization. Make sure that you have plenty of stakeholder engagement, though. Don't make those decisions unilaterally, because there's multiple folks that are affected by that, right? And then we do think that the TRMM is a good tool to help you check and adjust your progress. Next slide. And I'll leave you with just some NATF resources. We do have a dedicated page for resilience. From that, there's also a dedicated TRMM page, and from that you can get to the public website that you can see all of the tool and the supporting documentation there. And then we also have some process modeling information for you guys. One of the things that is really important in the model is making sure that you have good documentation and outlining of your processes. So that was something else I wanted to highlight for you. I think that might be it. I'll take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Lena. A lot of really good food for thought there, and some identification of a lot of opportunities downstream for industry as a whole, and for NATF and Epri as well. I know you saw one chat in the question in the chat. I'm not sure if you have a response to that one. See if anybody else has a question for Lena. Okay.
So Ken, I might just take that question in the chat offline. I know I went a little bit over, so let me think about that one, and I'll get back to Bennett on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks again, Lena. So next up, we have a report on resource adequacy project that Epri is engaged in. I believe Aidan Toohey is going to provide the overview here, and he's got some support from Jenna DiMaggiola. So, Aidan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ken, and please let me know if you can't hear me. I'm traveling at the moment, and the Wi-Fi where I am doesn't seem to be particularly great. So, but Jenna is on the line as well. If my audio starts becoming bad, then we can hand off to her. So, I'm going to talk through a recent effort we kicked off in light, particularly events in Texas in February, but even more generally, the resource adequacy issues that are coming up in California and Europe and in other parts of the world. As we change the resource mix on the system, and as we start to consider some of these extreme events, the kind of resilience-related events, we're thinking we need to update how we do resource adequacy. I'm sure most folks are familiar with the kind of general concepts, but I'll go through some of those first, and then talk specifically about the Epri project. So the next slide just gives a quick overview of where we're at in kind of the adequacy area. And why it matters. So when we think about where we're going as an electric system, we're looking at a greater portion of societal needs being met as we electrify heat and transport and other industry. we'll need probably at least a reliable system, as reliable as it is now, but possibly even more reliable. If you don't have your electricity right now, that's a big deal. But if you don't also have your means of transport and heat, that becomes even more important. So we're moving to a system that may become more reliable. And on top of that, then we're changing the grid. We're seeing more exposure to certain types of hazards. So we will need to have different kind of performance. We need to make sure that we have an adequate system that can also balance supply demand when we think about renewables coming onto the grid. We need to potentially make sure we have sufficient system services, sufficient flexibility. All of those types of things are going to be increasingly important. So as we bring those on and as we start to think about extreme weather events, we need to update the kind of message that we have traditionally used, or traditionally with resource adequacy. It's essentially being, do we have sufficient capacity and maybe sometimes energy to meet a kind of peak requirement. It moves away from that to thinking about kind of what are the actual risks that we're going to be exposed to, and how do we model those, and then how do we make sure we have sufficient resources to manage that. And obviously on the customer side, we're seeing increased customer engagement, and that needs to be considered as well. So all of those things are important, and were brought to light, I guess, by a lot of the stuff that happened in Texas in February, but also last summer California, and we've heard other types of adequacy-related events popping up more in the last few years as well. Just as we, on the next slide, as we think about reliability and resilience as we're decarbonizing, we're about to release a white paper on this topic. More generally, when we think about the decarbonization studies that are being done in industry, we need to start, you see these different pathways for how we can decarbonize. Most of them have built some renewables, some will keep gas around a little bit longer. A lot of them look at building large amounts of transmission. And then we also are thinking about things like hydrogen or other types of long duration storage. So the next slide then shows that, and where we think about a system that has various reliability and resilience challenges. A lot of those decarbonization models don't consider the kind of nuts and bolts of how we actually operate the system hour to hour, how we ensure reliability and resilience. So grid stability typically isn't mentioned in those models at all. We're not looking at voltage and frequency issues, so that's not a big deal. But that is a big deal. It's not really kind of part of the project we're talking about, but it's something that's going to be important to consider as well. That we need to bring some of those considerations in. The balancing issues, the kind of more operational balancing, is something we need to think about. Transmission and distribution. Some of those models have high level representation of long distance transmission, and look at how we might need to bring more transmission to bring wind from the Midwest to the coast, or solar from the Southwest to other parts of the country. But the other piece then, if you click through, it shows that we are seeing, if you click just once, we'll see the kind of annual shares of wind and solar increase from the current 10% or less, or maybe in some regions a little bit more, up to 30 or 40%. Instantaneously, that can be even higher. You look at somewhere like Southwest Power Pool, and that's definitely showing, 75% of the time it's at over 70% penetration by 2030 in some of the systems that we're looking at. So there are these large amounts of hours when we see high penetrations of renewables. So we need to start thinking about how adequacy needs to be considered, particularly when you think about extreme events. And extreme events in the adequacy context could be the kind of hurricanes, wildfires, storms, things like that knock out transmission, so you can't access resources from elsewhere. But also things like long durations without a lot of wind energy. Are we considering those types of extreme weather events? They're not necessarily extreme from people aren't worried about property damage or anything, but they're certainly extreme from a grid perspective. If you've got a lot of wind energy and you get 3 weeks without a whole lot of wind energy, so how are we actually modeling that and ensuring that is important in the future? The next slide then. Sorry. Yeah. So the next slide kind of gets into some of the actual definitions and how we're thinking about adequacy changing. So in the past, I mentioned we think about, do we have sufficient capacity to meet peak demand? In areas with a lot of hydropower, energy was always important, but we are now seeing, do you have the energy behind the generation capacity to meet that demand? So think about what would happen in Texas with the gas supply, or thinking about a future with large amounts of solar capacity. That the capacity might be there, but there's certainly no energy if it's not sunny. So have we got enough energy to last us through events? And so it's not just the peak demand, but the megawatt hours as well as the megawatts. have we got the flexibility to move across periods as the solar goes down? Do we have something that can come off quickly enough that can provide the balance of supply and demand in those time frames? And potentially even looking at, do we have sufficient system services to mitigate some of the kind of extreme events? Do we have the inertia, frequency support? Do we have the voltage control? Not talking here about getting into detailed system modeling with adequacy studies, but from a higher level, if you have the capacity, energy, and flexibility, but you don't have sufficient system services, your system still isn't really adequate. So trying to think through how we actually bring all of these together in the kind of adequacy framework is a lot of the focus of our project here. The next slide starts getting into a little bit more detail on what we're doing. Or sorry, actually, first of all, I'm just going to talk a bit about some of our existing work. And so we've got a few papers we did. We had a last summer after California, we put a paper out with the links on the slides for afterwards. And then just in February, around the time of the Texas event, we had a paper we worked on across our market operations, renewable integration, and resource planning areas at Epri, looking at extreme events, all qualitative, but looking at this from how we think about natural gas supply, for example, how we think about other extreme contingencies when we think about adequacy. And so we tried to look at some of those extreme events and what are the potential considerations. And sure enough, a lot of them actually kind of flagged the types of things that were happening in Texas in February. If you have those interdependencies and don't have those adequately modeled, you're potentially contributing. You're thinking a particular type of resource is going to contribute during stressful conditions more than it actually turns out to be. And bringing up the need for revisiting some of the methods we use when we calculate resource adequacy, whether it's the probabilistic loss of load expectation or the load carrying contribution that you assign for each of the individual types of resources. So how we actually revisit those, and that's a public paper as well. The link is there. So there's a lot of work already out there that we've done on this kind of topic, as well as a significant amount of industry activities as well. So the NERC Energy Reliability Assessment Task Force that was started off this year, looking at some of these energy issues, and talks about things like ramping, talks about things like gas electric interdependence. So currently identifying the gaps within the assessment time frame or the assessment processes that then additional research or additional recommendations can be made against. ESIG, the Energy Systems Integration Group, has done a fair bit of work around resource adequacy, and it's another one to be worth checking out. And then various national labs, IEEE, the various ISOs, others are doing work. There's a whole lot of work going on. One that's worth pointing out there towards the end is the European one, where they've revised their resource adequacy methods in light of the changes to the system, in light of things like climate change, and are looking at how to reassess that. They just released their new method this week, and it's very interesting to look at if folks are interested in that. So these are the kind of existing activities, and the next slide gets into additional activities that we've got going on. So next slide, please. The next slide. Yeah, sorry. So that's fine. So the initiative that we've started off, building on some of the past work we've done, is looking at three different kind of main areas where we're assessing some of these adequacy issues and looking at providing guidelines, tools, methods to the industry at the end of this project in early 2023. So the first part we're doing, and a lot of the focus of this work, a lot of the interest from the utilities and ISOs and NERC and others who are engaged, is around the processes that you use to assess adequacy in either the short run, months ahead type planning time frame, or even in the longer run as you're looking at future resource mixes. So the types of metrics you can use, we've traditionally used a loss of load expectation type metric, where you look at what's the expectation 1 day and 10-year type metric of having sufficient capacity to meet demand. Moving towards other metrics that are maybe more insightful on things like the energy availability or the ramping. So trying to look at things like expected unserved energy as well as ramp capability on the system, as well as the criteria we use. 1 day and 10 has kind of stood the test of time for the industry, but as we kind of are going to be increasingly reliant and customers do expect a very reliable system, what is that right metric that we should be using and the right criteria to underlie it. The big piece of that is obviously working with the various stakeholders across the industry. Certainly an area where Natf and Epri could talk more and coordinate on some of these, but also we're talking a lot with some of the regulators and other types of bodies that are actually setting some of those criteria and accepting some of the utility plans. So a big piece of the project also has that stakeholder kind of engagement. I should also mention that a lot of all of the work that we'll be doing will eventually become public by the end of the project. So all of these materials will be relevant and available given the nature of the project being very regulatory focused. Another big thing that we're going to be looking at is what are the scenarios you should study. So in the past we've studied typical years. You might study the last 30 years of weather, but you want to look forward and look at how the extreme events are going to unfold as the climate's changing. You also need to look at what are the right types of data that you need to be studying. I mentioned earlier on things like lulls of wind speed. We see that in places like Germany with 3-4 weeks potentially of very little wind, and if you're going to be relying on that wind or relying on that wind to charge storage that then can be used to provide your capacity, how does that change when you've got these multiple weeks? And so thinking through some of those issues and being able to come up with those scenarios. The other scenario aspect there is to think through scenarios for what the future would look like. And so if, for example, you're getting a lot of renewables on the system, then chances are you are getting a lot of batteries as well, and maybe some other types of technology. So being internally consistent in how you develop those future scenarios, that we can kind of build up scenarios, 3-4 different potential futures that we can then test the reliability of the system against. So that whole scenario database and tools will be part of the work we're doing. The models aspect, developing and providing guidelines for the models that could be used in these assessments, whether it's wind or solar PV, where there's a pretty good understanding from the last few years, but still different methods that are used and providing some guidance on that, or whether it's looking at things like demand side resources that are coming in. Also looking at things like how we look at the transmission network, particularly if you're going to be relying on power from relatively long distance. The reliability, resilience of the transmission system is going to be increasingly important for some of these kind of resource provision of reliability as well. And then tools to help you kind of parameterize some of the data so that we can make sure we've got the right models and data being used. The last thing we're doing, and we're in the process of doing it right now, is Jenna will talk about this in a little bit more detail in a little bit, is the kind of existing tools that are out there for adequacy, as well as new tools that are being developed, particularly places like national labs and universities. Being able to understand what those tools are able to do. The idea is not to recommend one tool or decide that one tool is the best tool, but rather look across the suite of tools and identify what are the kind of current capabilities that most tools have, what are the gaps that most tools have, how should we use different types of tools and different software. And then if we need to, in part of the project, we'll be looking at developing algorithms and open source code. So a lot of what we're talking about is adding more detail to models, running more cases, looking at more potential futures. Obviously, a big challenge with that is the computational time. So if we can think about ways to speed up the actual computation, whether it's using high performance computing or using machine learning to improve the simulations themselves, we'll be looking at providing those types of algorithms out to the industry afterwards so that they can be incorporated into either commercial or open source tools. Underlying all of this will be a set of case studies to kind of prove out the concepts that we're developing. So we've got case studies that Jenna will mention in a while, but they're covering a variety of different regions to be able to kind of show that not everyone is the same. And if you're in the Northwest, you've got a very different type of consideration than, say, the Southeast, and in both in the current system as well as in what your future might look like. And so the methods and tools, maybe the importance of certain types of methods, the importance of certain types of algorithms will vary. And so looking across those to assess that. And we've kicked off a few of the case studies already with some commercial tools. Some of them we're doing ourselves, some we've contracted, but the idea is to kind of get some learnings from them on an ongoing basis throughout the project. We'll also be doing these workshops. So we've got workshops for the members that I'll talk about in a second. And then we also have a stakeholder group that meets a little less frequently, but that is intended to kind of provide guidance on the overall project. And we just kicked that stakeholder group off here in the last couple of months. So being able to use that to do a lot of the tech transfer and deliver the work out. The next slide will show the members of the project. These are still kind of in flux, but the ones on the left are pretty much done and are part of this. So if you're on here and not aware that your company's involved and you're interested, certainly shoot me a note or Jen a note, and we can get you engaged. We've got others that are still Tallington, and we still look to add additional members over the next couple of months. The project started already, but I think there's a lot of value still to happen. So the point of this is not to kind of sell others, but really to kind of show the variety of different places across the country, different ISOs that are actually involved. NERC themselves actually participate in this project as well, given the importance there, and we may be adding a few additional members there soon as well. So if there's any interest in that or interested in engaging, then certainly let us know. The next slide then, and I think this might be the last one that I'll kind of talk through and then hand it off to Jenna, but getting into kind of some of the risks issues and what we're looking at here. So getting into some of the more technical discussion. Traditionally with adequacy, you've kind of thought about that middle row. Do we have, you look at different risks around different types of weather, so you look at multiple weather years. You might consider some of the fuel supply issues, certainly gas or renewable fuel, obviously by looking at the weather. The availability of the assets, you have the E4D, the outage rates that will be used in those studies, and then any kind of structural forecast there as you look out 3-4 years in terms of demand and how much might show up. So you bring all that together in the model and look at that probabilistically, and there's a set of well-tested metrics to study those types of things. As we start thinking about some of these systematic risks on top, so there are additional risks that we need to be thinking through. The demand, the actual underlying behavior, the underlying forecast has become a lot more uncertain. We've gone from a period of flat demand growth to potentially a significant amount of demand growth, but not just in a steady way. We see a lot of things like electric vehicles and other kind of distributed resources coming into the system. That may change the shape of the demand, may change when the peak load happens, may shift energy around the year, that type of thing, as well as just grow the overall demand. So being able to kind of think through what that type of risk can be and how that is assessed, and certainly looking at the coherency of the assumptions there. If we see, for example, a lithium ion getting very cheap and bringing a lot of batteries, then it probably means there's also going to be a lot of electric vehicles. So having those types of coherencies built in, looking at things like if we are going to be building a lot of wind and solar, that presumably means we're interconnecting the system more and having to build more transmission either locally to just bring that to the load nearby or potentially even long distance transmission as well, depending on how the economics and policy and other things play out. But being kind of consistent in how we think through that. And then things like the market structures themselves, if we have areas with deregulated markets, there may be different build outs than areas that are vertically integrated, and kind of thinking through what that might mean as we change the system. We don't think that those can all be modeled as much as we need to be thinking through on that top level of risk, different potential futures, and then assessing the reliability under each of those futures and looking at where there's reliability challenges. And then obviously on the bottom, when we think about high impact, low frequency, really the kind of focus of the stress testing the system. Traditionally, that's not been a big focus of adequacy. You think you throw enough data at it and you run a large Monte Carlo kind of simulation. Well, you probably captured a few outlier events in that data. You might not actually explicitly report what happens under a very cold winter or under something that results in gas network outages or potentially even cyber attacks, even though that's not going to be a big focus of the work here. But things like some of those types of high impact, low frequency issues. So one of the things we're really going to be trying to look at here is how do we bring some of those issues into the adequacy framework, and likely as not, it's going to be you still make sure that your thousands of cases accurately sample and accurately represent those high impact, low frequency events. But you probably also have to actually just look explicitly at them and understand, okay, well, our loss of load, our 1 day in 10 still stands. We still have a reliable system from that point of view. But if we were going to have an extreme heat event or extreme cold event or some other type of common cause issue, this is what would happen under those types of stress test conditions. And then you can kind of make decisions as to, even though they might fall under the overall probability threshold, do we want to actually be robust against those, and what are the types of mitigations we can actually do there? And then it also gets into, by doing that, then you can test things like, do we have sufficient, where's our load setting, where's our black start going to be, those types of things as well that we can kind of get into. So we really feel that bringing that stress test aspect into some of the adequacy methods that traditionally hasn't been in standard adequacy studies hasn't always been concluded will be very important. So that's one of the things we really want to bring into the project as we're doing these case studies and methodology developments. With that, I will hand it off to Jenna, who's been leading quite a bit of the actual, most of the on the ground work. So I think that the next slide, Jenna, do you want to start from here?
Sure, I can run through, just highlight a few of the things we've been working on so far. So this just shows a project schedule. And one thing you'll note is we have workshops scheduled every quarter with our members, and then advisory groups every 6 months. Idea being there for the members is we're really asking for a fair amount of input in terms of what they'd like us to study and what kind of things they see as the most important. So having those regular workshops there has been really critical. And the way we're structuring it is we're having each workshop focus on a specific piece of what we're looking at. So the first workshop was really more focused around the metrics and criteria piece of our work. And then the upcoming workshop, which we're having beginning of December, is more focused around the tool capabilities part of the work. We're also entertaining the idea of having some kind of vendor forum. So we'll be asking our members if they'd like that or not, and what kind of format would be most useful for them in that context. And then one thing I'll add about the advisory group, like Aidan said, it's a little bit more regulatory focused, and we're essentially just hoping to ensure that our work's as broadly applicable as it can be, and focused on having this group of people providing feedback, but then hopefully also helping us disseminate results and advocate for some of the changes that we've been doing here. A few folks on our regulatory committee includes people like NIRUC, ESIG and IEEE, consultants like E3, so a fair number of people there as well. Next step, please. So as I said before, we kicked this off in May. We do have our first deliverable due soon. So that's the metrics and criteria piece that we were focusing on in our first member workshop. And what we did there is we brought out an extended outline, and we were really asking for input from members in terms of whether they thought we were looking at the right things and what else they'd like to get covered. And I'll speak about that in a little more detail in the next slide. So I'll leave it at that for now. And then another piece of that was kicking off our external advisory group in August, and the case studies that Aidan already mentioned. Obviously, a lot of work to be done in terms of setting up 6 different case studies in 6 different regions. It's a fairly heavy lift. So we're further along in some regions than others, but making good progress there overall. Next slide, please. So this first deliverable that we've got is around determining metrics and criteria for resource adequacy. And this was actually one that was marked as kind of highest importance for our members when we polled them on which pieces of the analysis they were most interested in. The idea here is we've been using a lot of the same metrics and criteria for several decades now, and our system has been changing. We've been seeing a new resource mix. We're now focusing on changing climate and weather extremes and things like that. And those previous metrics that may have worked very well in the past might not work in the future. So that's something we're wanting to look into here. And I'll caveat this by saying, I don't think we're hoping to come up with a single guideline, like a 1-day and 10-year guideline. It's more about coming up with a set of guidelines that different systems can use to assess what works for their specific system. So not as much of a blanket statement there. And the way we're scheduling this, we've got this broken up into 2 deliverables, one that we'll be releasing in a few weeks, and then another one at the end of the project. And the first deliverable there is a white paper, and we are evaluating kind of existing and proposed metrics there, and doing a survey around the world to see which ones are used where. And then for this metric, for this white paper, we're laying out a methodology of what we'd like to accomplish in the rest of the project in terms of evaluating those metrics and those criteria. And then that second version of the paper is where we'll actually come up with a specific guideline. So in the first paper, it's more of a a little bit of a literature review and a roadmap for the next year. And then that second paper is where we'll actually come up with the specific guidelines. Next slide, please. Another initiative that we've started as part of this is a review of adequacy assessment tools. So what we're trying to do here is document the capabilities of the main commercial and open source software tools. And this is less about comparing a tool A to a tool B and more about getting an idea for where the industry is as a whole. So getting an idea for which tool functionalities are going to be fairly standard across all tools and which ones might be a little more niche or specific, and then also which functionalities might be necessary but are missing from tools. What are the gaps there? Another piece of this is really looking at how the different functionalities are implemented across tools. So if you look at something like energy storage, chances are most tools will have that implemented in one way or another, but it might not be implemented in the same way. So that's a distinction that we'd like to make and like to look into. And then a third piece of that would be looking into under which conditions you need to use a certain tool capability. Because obviously we want to use all the capabilities all the time, but computationally that's not always tractable. So giving folks some guidance on which capabilities are necessary for a certain system for a certain study duration. And again, for that, we split it up into 2 deliverables, one due sooner and then another one due at the end of the project. And so for that first deliverable, we actually just released a request for information to resource adequacy tool vendors. And I can post that in the chat after I'm done speaking, but that'll give us an idea of what's being done currently, and we're hoping to kind of aggregate those results and summarize them and post them on the website. And then there's a second piece of that, which will be trying out certain tools with our case studies and certain capabilities and getting an idea of when they're necessary versus not, and then also asking tool vendors at the end of the study what's changed since we last spoke to them, because this is an area that's moving so quickly that they might have additional functionality added in the next year or so that we want to make sure to capture. And then next slide, please. So quickly, just to go over the reasons we chose to structure this around case studies, and those are being carried out in parallel. One thing is to identify the gaps and needs. So rather than focusing on a test system or a single system, really looking at a broad range of systems allows us to see how some things might be implemented differently, or some things might be a gap in one system and not in the other. There's also the idea of demonstrating new developments. We can write up all the guidelines that we like, but we really want to make sure those are, that we've proven that they work in real systems. A third piece of that is allowing for adoption to structure. When we've spoken with different people, a lot of people have said, you can do this study in one area, that's great, but is it going to be applicable in my specific regulatory structure with the specific processes that I have in place? So that's something we're wanting to evaluate. And then finally, the increased value to members. There's case studies that we're running that are specific system that's the system that our funders are in, and that's obviously an extended value for them there, being able to see it applied to their system. Next slide, please. Just to go over case studies, these are the regions we've identified. I won't spend too much time on this in the interest of time, just to say we're further along in some than the others. MISO and SPP, a lot of interest just in terms of our funder base in those regions. MISO built in Servum and SPP in Plexos. WEC, which we were originally thinking about California, but as we've been looking at WEC's, really a lot of the interest there is looking at the different interconnections with neighbors, Northeast as well, especially the fuel supply issues there. Southeast, especially looking at a vertically integrated utility, ERCOT, where there's obviously been a lot of interest. And then just want to highlight, there's a few other studies that are going on in parallel to this at Epri, in Hawaii, in ISO New England, and GCCIA. And we're definitely wanting to bring all those learnings from those studies into this larger project. Next slide, please. I think this should be my last. So just to say, we've made some pretty good progress here. Next steps, we're looking at publishing that metrics and criteria paper. We've published the RFI. We've made some good progress on scenario tool development and reference models, working on the case studies, and that's a bit of an ongoing effort, as I talked about initially. And then in terms of ongoing engagement with our members, that's something we're really trying to prioritize. We do have the tool vendor workshop beginning in December. And what we try to do in all of our workshops is break out into small breakout groups for at least half of that time, just to make sure that we're hearing from every individual member. That being said, I think I took a few more minutes there than I had planned to, but feel free to post in the comments if you have any questions, and I can answer them there, or Aiden can answer them.
Okay, well, thank you, Jenna and Aiden. Any quick questions for them on this topic? Obviously, an area that's of high importance, and really taking a different look at resource adequacy given the significant change in the system that we're working with. Okay, well, if folks do have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. You can either answer them online or in follow-up. So next up, we have Dr. Randy Horton from Epri, and he's going to give us an update on the work that Epri's doing on electromagnetic pulse. Randy?
All right. Well, thank you, Ken, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys. I think it's been probably couple of years since I've spoken to this group. I wish we were able to do this face to face, but unfortunately, COVID put the nix on that. But I see a lot of familiar names. I was going to say faces, but I guess I can't see your face. But a lot of familiar names in the chat, and so glad to be here. So I wanted to kind of start us off thinking back, sort of where we were when we started in this process about 5.5 years ago, and if you've been involved in the HAL2 DMP for a while, you know that back then when we started this project, there was significant potential for both regulatory as well as legislative action. And but the problem was there wasn't a technical basis for understanding what the potential impacts might be or how you go about mitigating those impacts, doing something different than, basically the only thing out there was the mill standard. So we came in and started this research program to kind of answer some of those questions. And I remember this may have been around 2015. I remember having a conversation with one of my colleagues at the Department of Defense, and it's basically been his entire career working on EMP. And he's like, let me tell you something, Randy, it's going to take you 10 years and at least $20 million to solve this problem. And I kind of thought to myself, it's like, it might take you that long because you're the government, but we can do it a lot faster than that. But we're about almost 6 years into this, and I think he was correct. But at the end, I figured out he was trying to give me a compliment. The government's been working on this for 50 years and still working on it. So, I think at this stage we have been working on this for a while, but we've made significant progress. And as we sit here today, there's still a potential for regulatory action. There's still that same potential for legislative action, sort of waxes and wanes depending on the administration. But the big difference now is we have that technical basis for what the impacts are. We have the technical basis for how to go about mitigating those using things other than the mill standards. And so we're making significant progress, and I think this project is one of those great examples of how industry and government can come together, solve a very complicated problem, starting out with just basic R&D and kind of transitioning that way all the way to applying different things in the field. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today is what we've been doing on some of these pilot projects we've had going on, as well as what some of the lessons learned coming out of that process are. So if you go to the next slide. And I'm sure that not everyone in the audience has been following what HAL2 DMP is and that kind of thing. So I'll just kind of give you a quick overview of what we're talking about here to kind of level set everyone, and in particular what I'm going to be talking about here today. So High-altitude EMP refers to the detonation of a nuclear weapon, either at high altitude, something above 20 to 30 kilometers above the Earth's surface, or up in space. It could be above 100 kilometers or so above the Earth's surface, or even higher. And when that explosion occurs, it creates 3 different electromagnetic pulses. You've got this E1 pulse, which we're going to focus on today. This is very fast rise time, basically a radio frequency type of impulse. And so everything looks, all conductive objects essentially look like a antenna that can absorb RF energy. And it's also can be a very strong electromagnetic field. The unclassified peak levels are up to 50 kV per meter, so very strong. And then right after that, you have this field called E2. So it also couples through the air. It's very similar to a nearby lightning strike. The big difference is the field levels are low, so not really any impacts expected. And then following that, you have this E3 event, which is a very short duration, lasts a few minutes, but is very similar to a geomagnetic disturbance. So, the work that Kevin was talking about earlier that we're doing on GMD events can be actually leveraged into some of the E3 work. But when these events go off, or if we were to have one of these attacks, you could get these 3 different electromagnetic pulses. And what our initial or phase 1 research that we like to call it, basically where we came out of that is E3 can cause blackout of the system. E1 can cause electronics damage. E2 we didn't find really to have much of an impact on the transmission system. But if you look at these combined effects, you could find yourself in a situation where you might be in a voltage collapse or blackout scenario, maybe something like on the order of 2003 blackout. And then if you had electronics damage or damage to your communication systems and so on from E1, then you could find yourself with a degraded recovery capability. And so we really felt like the focus of future research, sort of the most bang for the buck was really doing additional research in this E1 space. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So just to kind of get just a little bit more detailed in that, and then we'll start talking about some of these pilot projects. Is the diagram I've got here shown on this slide is kind of an illustration of what that E1 effects are. So you've got the electromagnetic pulse you see coming there from the left, and what you're seeing there is a substation control building with control cables coming in. You've got relay racks and so on. And so there's really two components to that E1 threat that we're interested in. One is the conducted threat, and that's where you've got unshielded control cables, for example, that can absorb that RF energy and actually have voltage and current transients induced into those cables, which then propagate into the substation control building and can damage or upset the electronics that they're connected to, for example, a digital protective relay. And then the other piece of this is what we call the radiated threat, and that's where you might have part of that electromagnetic pulse come in, propagate through part of the building structure, and then actually induce voltage and current transients. Think about it like as on a circuit board level. So you're actually impacting the device itself. And so as we evaluate impacts and look for mitigation options, we're always thinking about both the conducted and the radiated threat together. Next slide. So as I mentioned, kind of coming out of our phase 1 research, we really wanted to focus on E1 impacts and 2 things primarily. One is, what would the specific impacts be to substations, looking at a specific substation design. In our past work, we were making a lot of assumptions on what the just sort of basic cable runs and real simple relay models and things like that. So through our R&D process, we've developed some pretty significant modeling capabilities where we can now model full substations in detail. And so what we want to do with this project is take actual substation designs and evaluate those. And the next thing was, once you understand what the impacts are, how do you go about mitigating those in that specific substation design, looking at both greenfield sites as well as existing substations. And so we launched this project where we've got 19 pilot projects across the U.S., and we also have about another 15, I would say 15 to 20 utilities that are kind of watching what's going on in these pilot projects. So in total, it's about 35 or so utilities that are participating in this work. And so for each one of those utilities, they've selected a single substation. We go in and do an evaluation of that particular substation design, if it's an existing one or, you know, basically the actual design of a new substation. And we evaluate it for different levels of an EMP threat up to that 50 kV per meter level. We then provide the results back to the utility, work with them on basically providing recommendations on what to change in the design to mitigate the impacts, and then work with the utility to get those designed and installed in the field, and then go back and do testing where we can to evaluate the efficacy. So a very important pilot project from the standpoint of better understanding what those specific impacts will be, as well as what it takes to harden it. And then in the hardening process, getting all those lessons learned back out to the public so that, you know, utilities don't make the same mistake. They can learn from each other what's a good way to do it and what's not a good way to do it. So those projects right now are several of them have been complete, but a lot of them are in different different states of completion due to COVID, number of construction schedule limitations and things like that. But what I'm going to primarily talk about today is sort of the outcomes of some of this work. Next slide. And so just to kind of give you an idea as I go through some of these next slides, some of the mitigation options that are currently being deployed and thought about as we go through these projects. So one of the first ones is improved electromagnetic shielding of substation control buildings. So we've done a lot of work working not only with utilities, but also control building manufacturers to better understand how you can design these buildings to provide the appropriate level of electromagnetic shielding that we need to protect substation grade electronics. So one of the key things we're trying to look for is how do you take into account the inherent resiliency of devices that are used in substations? These, for example, digital protective relays have to withstand a lot of electromagnetic transients that already exist in a substation environment. So we were trying to better understand, okay, are there some things that you can do that doesn't require an 80 dB Faraday cage like you have to have in the mill standards, but still provide the appropriate level of protection up to the 50 kV per meter level. So we've done a lot of work in that space to better understand how to design these control buildings. The other thing is using shielded control cables, but also having the shields of the control cable grounded at each end, and then also understanding, can you use pigtails or not? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but basically the grounding of the shield is also very important. The use of low voltage surge protection devices. So one of the things we found in our first phase of research, and continue to find this, is the voltage surges that can propagate along signal cables can damage relay inputs. For example, voltage inputs into the voltage input to the relay, or even the current input to the relay. So basically providing some type of protection for that. Use of hemp filters. So we don't necessarily recommend those for PNC type applications, but for AC station service or your DC system, they work fine. So we've kind of worked through how to get those installed in substations. And then one of the obvious ones is obviously not all relays, even within the same relay vendor, have the same susceptibility level. So just having a good understanding of what relays can handle what levels of electromagnetic pulse, whether it be radiated or conducted threats, and identifying, okay, well, if I select this relay over this relay, I also provide a higher level of capability. And then lastly, the use of fiber optic based systems. So for example, the IEC 61850 type solutions. Next slide. And so this is an example of one of those that's actually installed in the field. So CenterPoint Energy developed this, and we helped them test it and evaluate it. And then it's actually in the field as we sit here today under evaluation. And my understanding is it's actually sort of live, if you will. And so the way this particular system works is you have your relays inside the substation control building, which you can see there to the right, but they are in a shielded enclosure. And in this case, the shielded enclosure actually does meet the MIL standard. And then from there, you've got fiber optic cables that go out into the substation yard where you have your merging units in the breaker cabinets or other places where you get your analog signals. And so this is a very good way of doing hardening in situations where it's not easy to put in a six-sided metal building, for example, for your substation control building. So CenterPoint's done a lot of work in this, and so this is we found to be a very good solution, but also an example of something that has been evaluated and is actually installed in the field. Next slide. You can keep going. So what I'm kind of going to step through here is just quickly kind of talk about some of the lessons learned that we've gotten from some of these projects, and just kind of give you some things to think about if you're in the mode of considering EMP hardening for some of your substations. These are just some things to think about. Some are probably obvious, but it always helps to have the obvious with a technical basis, which is what we've been trying to do even on some of the more simple items. So I would say the overarching theme is think about EMP hardening early. It's a whole lot easier to do it on the front end than it is to come back behind and try to do it from a retrofit situation. So retrofits, that last example I just showed, is a really good way to do that. But in some cases, the IEC 61850 might not be an option. Then you have to go back and try to take traditional PNC design and then EMP hardening. That can be quite challenging. So key is just kind of think about it early, and the reason for that, you can make changes to your PNC design up front a whole lot easier. You can go ahead and design your substation control building to have the appropriate level of electromagnetic shielding. You don't have to go back and replace shielded cables, or unshielded cables with shielded cables, and have to worry about how to ground the shields properly, which that can be a super headache and very expensive. It's also easier when you're doing an initial design to put in the appropriate bulkheads and EMC type glands and things like that for the cable shielding. And then the other thing is hemp mitigation may dictate other aspects of your control building design. So we've seen situations like that, and so the big takeaway is, if you're going to do this, it's always best to think about it up front and build it in. It's much less expensive to do that than to come back later and try to redo it. Next slide. The other thing we've kind of found, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done in this area, but I think the main theme is hardening everything, all the substations in your footprint. Is not practical, for one, but it's also probably not necessary. So we're trying to come up with ways to basically statistically look at some of this stuff. But if you start thinking about modeling or hardening every substation, that can get really expensive. It's also very challenging, especially for retrofit situations. The other piece of that is, at this stage, it's almost like doing insulation coordination studies 50 years ago, where we're still trying to work out the details of what clearances and insulator lengths might need to be for structures, for example. And so we're almost having to model each substation to develop a specific design just for that substation. And, our hope is that at some point we get to a point where we can have kind of standardized designs, or at least a particular utility could have its own standardized designs, but we're just not there yet. So really, if you wanted to harden each station, you almost have to model each station, and that's just almost not doable. And then, but the other piece of it is really needing to look at what the actual risk is. So we've done a lot of work trying to figure out how to quantify what those risks are. So for example, if you had a particular substation design and you could do a very detailed assessment and show that there's like a 2% probability of failure or 5% probability of failure, that's probably not one you want to pick unless it's a supercritical substation. Whereas if you had one that's 50% probability of failure, and it's a critical substation, you know, it's probably something that's definitely on your list. So we're trying to work through how to do that. And then lastly, it's been a long, I guess probably, I was about to say it's been a long time, but basically it's almost never. DOE put out recommended EMP environments back last January that basically, for all practical purposes, lowered that 50 kV per meter threshold to 25 kV per meter threshold, where they were able to say in an unclassified manner that the existing threat is 25 kV per meter, and then possible future threats might be 50 kV per meter. So that also gives utilities an option to say, well, you know, maybe for an existing threat, that's what I want to harden my system to, but it at least gives options to the utility. So those are some things to consider when you're trying to determine which stations to harden. Next slide. The other thing we've seen, and I was going to say maybe hopefully an animation will work here, is when you're building these substation control buildings, you can build them to be really good shields. You can install things like waveguides below cutoffs, which might be a conduit coming out the side of the building so that you can, you know, fish wires through and stuff like that. And it really protects the building from the radiated threat. But if you take a conductor, like for example, a ground grid conductor or an unshielded cable or something like that, and run it through that waveguide below cutoff, all it does is basically absorb all that RF energy outside the building and then re-radiates it inside the building. So one of the things we've tried to do from a educational standpoint is, you know, waveguide below cutoffs are not the cure-all. If you're bringing cables in, you really have to have shielded cables and then ground those shields properly. Otherwise, you're basically defeating the shield because that conductor is re-radiating inside the building. So that's one of the things we've learned. Next slide. Another thing, and we've really tried this and then spent a significant amount of testing kind of proving this out, but one of the hopes that we and a number of our members had was that ferrites would mitigate conductive threats, because you can buy ferrites that mitigate surges, or I would say frequency content, probably not surges, in the same realm of E1 surges. So it sounded really promising. Problem was, as soon as we went and tested this, when you start looking at the levels of the surge that would be propagating along the cables and actually what would damage something like a digital protective relay, the ferrite materials saturate and basically provide no mitigation whatsoever. So that was one of the things we finally drove to conclusion through a significant amount of laboratory testing. But that's one of the things we try to make people aware of, because you can go to YouTube today and look at videos with people saying, "Oh, buy this ferrite device for hemp mitigation," but it just doesn't work, because if you actually use representative surges to test them, they basically saturate and just don't work. So that's an important thing we try to make people aware of. Next slide. The other thing is, as we go and look at or evaluate the shielding effectiveness of substation control buildings, one of the things we found is that the MIL standard is a very conservative way of determining shielding. So the graph there on the left is an example of what the amount of attenuation that a substation control building provides as a function of frequency. So this is a control building. We went and tested it using basically that continuous wave type of method, where for each individual frequency, you know what you transmit, you receive it inside the building, and then you can calculate how much attenuation you have and then plot it as a function of frequency. And that's what the MIL standard uses to determine shielding effectiveness. So this particular substation building, if you follow that protocol, you basically would say, okay, this is essentially a 20 dB building. We also tested that same building in our RS-105 test facility, and because of the frequency range that you're in with regards to E1, building actually behaves like it's about a 60 dB building if you actually hit it with a synthetic EMP pulse and go measure the fields inside the building. So the big takeaway is, obviously you want to have some type of threshold that you're using to determine shielding effectiveness requirements for your buildings, but just be mindful that MIL standard is very conservative with respect to what you would actually expose equipment to in a actual situation. Next slide. Other thing we found is as soon as you start trying to add in different things for doors, it becomes very complicated, and with the supply chain issues we're having now, it makes it even worse. But hemp hardened doors are expensive, and it takes them a long time to get here. And as soon as you try to add something like a ballistic door or a hemp hardened door that's also ballistic proof, that gets crazy hard to get, and also very difficult to design. So we've had some experiences where ballistic proofing the substation control building was also important, as well as hemp, and getting those design details right with both of those was very difficult. And so that's things that we're learning. You start adding things together as it gets more complicated, as you might expect. Next slide. And then I guess the next couple of slides is basically just kind of demonstrating the importance of how you ground the shield of your control cables for EMP applications. So the big takeaway I want everyone to leave this with is pigtails don't work for EMP applications. They're fine for other applications, assuming they're run appropriately and are short. But when you start getting the frequency ranges of high-altitude EMP, they just don't work. So we did a lot of testing to kind of prove this out. So the test that we did is referred to as the RS-105 test. So just want to kind of provide a little bit of context, and then I'll go to the next slide. But you can see there on the left, this is our test facility in Charlotte. We've got essentially a Marks generator. I'm looking at the top left picture here. Marks generator on the left is connected to a wire antenna, and what that does is it creates this vertically polarized electromagnetic pulse that represents that 50 kV per meter E1 wave, and it actually propagates along the antenna. So what we did, if you go to the next slide, is one of our utility partners designed what they're referring to as basically a shielded yard box. And so using their equipment, we connected a shielded cable from between the two yard boxes. You can see one there on the right, one on the left. And we looked at this a couple of different ways. So we had the yard box on the right with an EMC gland, so that the cable was always grounded on the right side. And then in the yard box on the left, we either grounded the cable shield using the EMC gland, or we ran a pigtail, and we either had the pigtail running parallel or running perpendicular to the conductors, just to see what impact it would have. And so we ran 3 different cases. See the waveforms there on the right. So with that shielded cable, even with both ends of the cable grounded, or both ends of the shield grounded, until you have that low inductance path, which that EMC gland provides, you still were coupling significantly into the cable. So big takeaway here is for EMP applications, pigtails don't work. And so these are we're obviously from a project standpoint providing details of this, but this is important enough to kind of get it out into the industry proper. So I wanted to share that with you today. Next slide. Other thing is I've talked about these EMC glands. One way to kind of do the same thing is with a cable entry system. So that's an example of one there on the right. And these things work very well. We actually had some of the vendors when we were getting into this telling us that they kind of felt like their products were somewhat difficult to learn and kind of work through, but as we've been using these through or with some of our utility partners, we've actually found that they're easier to work with than we initially thought, and they work really well. So so those are things to consider as you're doing your substation design. Next slide. And I think this is my next and last slide. The other thing we've run into is when you're building these shielded boxes, an important aspect of that is to design them with an EMI gasket. And you have to pay a lot of attention. Just, you could have just the slightest weld imperfection that causes that gasket to have sort of a gap, and it significantly impacts the shielding of what's inside that box. So we've done a lot of testing. You can actually see the little D-dot probe there in the box, but we did a lot of testing to actually prove that out. So that's an important thing is once you start designing shielded enclosures that are going to be outside, pay a lot of attention to, you know, what those gaskets might be exposed to, and also how they made up to the metal or whatever the material might be. Next slide. And then lastly, you know, we've got all these pilot projects going on. We did a lot of work in that first 3 years to kind of better understand what the potential impacts were from a transmission standpoint, and really focusing heavily on transmission and distribution substations. So we're going to continue that work through these pilot projects, but we're also expanding our R&D into other areas like telecom systems. We have a project going on looking at E1 impacts of the telecom systems that are used in the bulk electric system. We're just starting a distribution project looking at what potential impacts and mitigation options might be for distribution systems. And we also have a project looking at impacts to generation, and all of these projects, if you're interested in joining, there's ample room for additional folks to join. We're actually looking for people to kind of help with that. So if you're interested in any of that, just feel free to let me know. We would be happy to connect you with that. So that's all I have. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them if there's any time to do that.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Randy. A lot of really good information, a lot of progress made on the studies and learning side of that. So appreciate you sharing. There is one question that has come in already for you, and it's if both ends of a shielded cable are grounded, is there a concern about ground loop currents?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, to mitigate that, you got to put a messenger cable in with the cables in order to mitigate that.
Okay, good. Other questions for Randy? We do have some time in the session for questions for all of the panelists, but any for Randy while we've got him here? Okay. Questions for any of the other panelists today, or for just general questions for either Epri or NATF? Well, I'm not seeing any. With that, I guess I'll turn it over to Andrew Phillips for some closing comments and wrap up. Andrew?
Thanks a lot, Ken, and thank you to all of the speakers and all of everybody who's online listening. It's been a really a lot of information over the last 2 afternoons, and it just shows to me how important and how the situations are continually changing, and we don't have a full understanding of every aspect. And it requires us to share what we do between different utilities, but also which really is the key part of the NATF model, and through Epri to explore the areas where there are gaps. And the demands on resiliency are only going to get higher as we become more dependent on electricity. And it's a little bit of a feedback loop. We're going to become more dependent on electricity because of decarbonization and the pressure to reduce the amount of CO2. And so as we electrify more to reduce CO2, the demands are going to become higher on reliability and resiliency. With that, the system is going to become more complex. There's going to be customer side resources. There's going to be increased variable generation. And as the system is getting more complex, the requirements for resiliency are getting even higher, and it's going to make it more important for us to have a really solid design basis, and then share all of those best practices and improve together as a team. And the collaboration between Epri and NATF in these resiliency events, but also in all of the other efforts that we've got underway, where we are working together, is going to make a huge difference for the industry, and is already making a huge difference for the industry. And we really appreciate all of the Epri staff. We appreciate all of the NATF staff that have really done the yeoman's duty in organizing this specific event. Ken and your team, thank you very much. And Finally, we really appreciate all of the transmission utilities that are our members that dedicate the resources to participate in these events and to share their information and to give us the guidance we need to make the right decisions. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any of the Epri team, any of the NATF team. We really appreciate it. And we're really looking forward to getting together next year face to face, because really the communication's been great. We've really done a great job of moving virtual, but there's so much more we can do when we're face to face, and we're looking forward to next year getting together with you. So thank you, Ken. Thank you to everybody online. Back to you, sir.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thanks. I'll echo my thanks to everybody for attending and all the presenters both days. It's been a really great 2-day session. As noted, we will present the post the presentations after the event, and those will be available either on the Epri site or for the NATF transport. And with that, one last thing, we will be sending out a feedback request survey as well. So we wanted to remind folks of that. So with that, we'll close the session. Thanks again for attending. I hope everybody has a great rest of your year, and we look forward to seeing you in person next March. Thanks for joining.